is going to be planned before the AGI. I think it's sort of like you get the AGI on the like 10 gigawatt cluster, like intelligent. Maybe you have like one more year where you're kind of doing some final unhobbling to fully unlock it. Then you have the intelligence explosion, and meanwhile the like $1 trillion cluster is almost finished. And then you do your super intelligence on your $1 trillion cluster, or you run it on your $1 trillion cluster. And by the way, you have not just your $1 trillion cluster, but like hundreds of millions of GPUs on inference clusters everywhere.
And this isn't like I think private in this world, I think private companies have the capital and can raise capital to do it.
The thing you will need the government force to do it fast.
I was just about to ask, like, wouldn't it be we know private companies are on track to be able to do this and beat China if they're unhindered by climate pledges or whatever.
Well, that's part of what I'm saying.
So if that's the case, and if it really matters that we beat China, there's going to be all kinds of practical difficulties of like, will the AI researchers actually join the AI effort? If they do, there's going to be 3 different teams at least who are currently doing pre-training on different companies. Now, who decides? At some point, you're going to have the YOLO the hyperparameters of the $1 trillion cluster. Who decides that? Just merging extremely complicated research and development processes across very different organizations. This is somehow supposed to speed up America against the Chinese. Why don't we just let
Brain and DeepMind merge? And it was like a little messy, but it was fine.
It was pretty messy, and it was also the same company, and also much earlier on in the process.
Pretty similar, right? Different code bases, and like lots of different infrastructure and different teams. And it was like it wasn't the smoothest of all processes, but DeepMind is doing, I think, very well.
I mean, look, you give the example of COVID, and the COVID example is like, listen, we woke up to it, maybe it was late, but then we deployed all this money, and COVID response to government was a clusterfuck over. And like the only part of it that was worked is I agree warp speed was like enabled by the government. It was literally just giving the permission that you can actually do.
It was also making like the big
advanced macro commitments or whatever. But I agree. But it was like fundamentally it was like a private sector led effort. That was the only part of COVID that worked.
I mean, I think the project will look closer to Operation Warp Speed, and it's not even. I mean, I think you'll have all the companies involved in the government project. I'm not that sold that merging is that difficult. You have one. You select one code base, and you run pre-training on like GPUs with one code base. And then you do the sort of second RL step on the other code base with TPUs. And, I don't know. I think it's fine. I mean, to the topic of like, will people sign up for it? They wouldn't sign up for it today. I think this would be kind of crazy to people. But also, I mean, this is part of the like secrets thing. People gather at parties or whatever. This. I don't think anyone has really gotten up in front of these people and been like, look, the thing you're building is the most important thing for like the national security of the United States, for like whether the free world will have another century ahead of it. Like this thing you're doing is really important, like for your country, for democracy. Don't talk about the secrets. And it's not just about DeepMind or whatever. It's about these really important things. And so, I don't know, like, again, we're talking about the Manhattan Project, right? This stuff was really contentious initially. But, at some point it was like clear that this stuff was coming. It was clear that there was like sort of a real sort of like exigency on the military national security front. And, I think a lot of people will come around on the, like, whether it'll be competent. I agree. I mean, this is again, where it's like a lot of the stuff is more like predictive in the sense, I think this is like reasonably likely. And I think not enough people are thinking about it. Like a lot of people think about like AI lab politics or whatever. But like nobody has a plan for the project. It's like,
should I make you more pessimistic about it? And like, we don't have a plan for it. We need to do it very soon because AGI is upon us. Then fuck, the only capable, competent technical institutions capable of making AI right now are private companies.
And they're going to play that leading role. It'll be a sort of a partnership basically. But the other thing is like, again, we talked about World War II and, American unpreparedness at the beginning of World War II. It was complete shambles, right? And so there's a sort of like very, I think America has a very deep bench of just like incredibly competent managerial talent. I think that, there's a lot of really dedicated people. And, I think basically a sort of Operation Warp Speed, public-private partnership, something like that, is sort of what I imagine it would look like.
Yeah. I mean, the recruiting the talent is an interesting question because the same sort of thing where initially for the Manhattan Project, you had to convince people we got to beat the Nazis and you got to get on board. I think a lot of them maybe regretted how much they accelerated the bomb. And I think this is generally a thing with war where...
I mean, I think they're also wrong to regret it, but...
Yeah, I mean, why?
What's the reason for regretting it?
I think there's a world in which you don't have... The way in which nuclear weapons were developed after the war was pretty explosive because there was a precedent that you actually can use nuclear weapons. Then because of the race that was set up, you immediately go to the H-bomb
I think my view is, again, this is related to the view on AI and maybe some of our disagreement, is like, that was inevitable. Like, of course, like, there's this, World War, and then obviously there was the the Cold War right after. Of course, like, the military and technology angle of this would be like, pursued with ferocious intensity. And I don't really think there's a world in which that doesn't happen, where it's like, we're all not going to build nukes. And also, just like, nukes went really well. I think that could have gone terribly, right? Like again, I mean, this sort of, I think this is like not physically possible with nukes, this sort of pocket nukes for everybody. But I think sort of like WMDs that are sort of proliferated and democratized, and like all the countries have it, like the US leading on nukes, and then sort of like building this new world order that was kind of US led, or at least sort of like a few great powers, and a non-proliferation regime for nukes, a partnership and a deal that's like, look, no military sort of application of nuclear technology, but we're going to help you with the civilian technology. We're going to enforce safety norms on the rest of the world. That worked. It worked. And it could have gone so much worse.
So zooming out,
and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were. I mean, I say this a bit in the piece, but it's like actually the A bomb, like the A bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was just like, the
firebombing,
firebombing. I think the thing that really changed the game was like the super, the H bombs and ICBMs, and then I think that's really when it took it to like a whole new level.
I think part of me thinks when you say we'll tell the people that for the free world to survive, we need to pursue this project. It sounds similar to World War II. So World War II is a sad story, obviously, in the fact that it happened, but also like the victory is sad in the sense that Britain goes in to protect Poland, and at the end, the USSR, which is as your family knows, is incredibly brutal, ends up occupying half of Europe, and the like part of like we're protecting the free world. That's why I got to rush the AI, and like if we end up with the American AI Leviathan, I think there's a world where we look back on this where it has the same sort of twisted irony that Britain going into World War II had about trying to protect Poland.
Look, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of unfortunate things that happen. I'm just hoping we make it through. I mean, to the point of it's like, I really don't think the pitch will only be the sort of like, the race. I think the race will be sort of a backdrop to it. I think the sort of general, like, look, it's important that democracies shape this technology. We can't just like leak this stuff to, North Korea is going to be important. I think also for the just safety, including alignment, including the sort of like creation of new WMDs. I'm not currently sold there's another path, right? So it's like, if you just have the breakneck race, both internationally, because you're just instantly leaking all this stuff, including the weights, and just, the commercial race, Demis and Dario and Sam, just kind of like, they all want to be first. I think it's incredibly rough for safety. And then you say, okay, safety regulation. But, it's sort of like, the safety regulation that people talk about, it's like, oh, well, NIST, and they take years and they figure out what the expert consensus is. And then they
Isn't that what's going to happen to the project as well?
But I think the sort of alignment angle during the intelligence explosion, it's going to, it's not a process of like years of bureaucracy and then you can kind of write some standards. I think it looks much more like basically a war, and like you have a fog of war. It's like, look, it's like, is it safe to do the next and it's like, we're like 3 into the intelligence explosion. We don't really understand what's going on anymore. Like a bunch of our like generalization scaling curves are like kind of looking not great. Some of our like automated AI researchers that are doing alignment are saying it's fine, but we don't quite trust them. In this test, the AI started doing naughty things, and but then we like hammered it out and then it was fine. And like, should we go ahead? Should we take, another 6 months? Also, by the way, like China just stole the weights, or we, they're about to like deploy the Roman army. Like, what do we do? I think it is this crazy situation. Basically you're relying much more on kind of like a sane chain of command than you are on sort of some like, deliberative regulatory scheme. I wish you were able to do the deliberative regulatory scheme. And this is the thing about the private companies too. I don't think, they'll claim they're going to do safety, but I think it's really rough when you're in the commercial race and they're startups, and startups are startups. I think they're not fit to handle WMDs.
Yeah, I'm coming closer to your position, but part of me also, so with the responsible scaling policies, I was told by people who are advancing that the way to think about this, because they know I'm like a libertarian type of person, and the way they approached me about it was that fundamentally this is a way to protect market based development of AGI, in the sense that if you didn't have this at all, then you would have this sort of misuse, and then it would have to be nationalized. And the RSPs are a way to make sure that through this deployment, you can still have a market-based order, but then there's these safeguards that make sure that things don't go off the rails. And I wonder if it seems like your story seems self-consistent, but it does feel, I know this was never your position, so I'm not I'm not looping you into this, but a sort of Mott and Bailey almost, in the sense of,
well, look, here's what I think about RSP type stuff, or sort of safety regulation that's happening now. I think they're important for helping us figure out what world we're in and like flashing the warning signs when we're close, right? And so the story we've been telling is sort of like, sort of what I think the modal version of this decade is. But it's like, I think there's lots of ways it could be wrong. I really, we should talk about the data wall more. I think there's like, again, I think there's a world where the stuff stagnates, right? There's a world where we don't have AGI. And so I basically, the RSP thing is like preserving the optionality. Let's see how this stuff goes. But like, we need to be prepared. Like if the red lights start flashing, if we're getting the automated AI researcher, then it's like, and it's crunch time, and then it's time to go.
I think, okay, I can be on the same page on that we should have a very, very strong prior on proceeding in a market-based way, unless you're right about what the explosion looks like, the intelligence explosion. And so like, don't move yet, but in that world where like really does seem like Alec Radford can be automated, and that is the only bottleneck to getting to ASI. Okay, I think we can leave it at that. I am somewhat of the way there.
Okay. Well, I hope it goes well. It's gonna be very stressful. And again, right now is the chill time. Enjoy your vacation while it lasts.
It's like funny to look out over. I've just like, this is San Francisco.
Yeah. And OpenAI's right there. Anthropic's there. I mean, again, this is kind of like, it's like you guys have this enormous power over how it's going to go for the next couple of years, and that power is depreciating.
Who's you guys?
Like, people at labs.
Yeah.
Okay. But it is a sort of crazy world. And you're talking about like, I feel like you talk about like, oh, maybe they'll nationalize too soon. It's like, almost nobody like really like feels it, sees what's happening. And it's, I think this is the thing that I find stressful about all this stuff is like, look, maybe I'm wrong, but like, if I'm right, we're in this crazy situation where there's like, like a few hundred guys that are like paying attention. It's daunting.
I went to Washington a few months ago, and I was talking to some people who are doing AI policy stuff there. And I was asking them how likely they think nationalization is. And they said, oh, like, it's really hard to nationalize stuff. It's been a long time since we've done it. There's these very specific procedural constraints on what kinds of things can be nationalized. And then I was asked, well, like ASI, so that means because there's constraints at the Defense Production Act or whatever that won't be nationalized. There's the Supreme Court would overturn that. And they're like, yeah, I guess that would be nationalized.
That's the short summary of my post or my view on the project.
Okay, so but before we go further on the AI stuff, let's just back up.
Okay.
We began the conversation. I think people will be confused. You graduated valedictorian of Columbia when you were 19. So you got to college when you were 15.
Right.
And you were in Germany. Then you got to college at 15. How the fuck did that happen?
I really wanted out of Germany. I went to kind of a German public school. It was not a good environment for me. I mean,
in what sense? It's just like no peers that are.
Yeah, look, I mean, it wasn't. Yeah, it was. There's also just a sense in which sort of like there's this particular sort of German cultural sense. I think in the US, there's all these like amazing high schools and like sort of an appreciation of excellence. And in Germany, there's really this sort of like Paul Poppy syndrome almost, right? Where it's, you're the curious kid in class and you want to learn more. Instead of the teacher being like, that's great. They're like, they kind of resent you for it and they're like trying to crush you. And there's also like, there's no kind of like elite universities for undergraduate, which is kind of crazy. So, the sort of, there's sort of like, basically like the meritocracy was kind of crushed in Germany at some point. Also, I mean, there's a sort of incredible sense of, complacency, across the board. I mean, one of the things that always puzzles me is like, even just going to a US college was this kind of like radical act. And like, it doesn't seem radical to anyone here because it's like, this is obviously the thing you do. And you can go to Columbia, but it's, it's very unusual. And it's wild to me because it's like, this is where stuff is happening. You can get so much of a better education, and like America is where, it's where all the stuff is, and people don't do it, and so anyway, so I don't know, I skipped a few grades, and I think at the time it seemed very normal to me to kind of like go to college at 15 and come to America. I think now one of my sisters is now like turning 15, and so then and I look at her and I'm like, now I understand how my mother reacted to this plan.
And then so you get to college, you were like presumably the only 15-year-old there.
Yeah.
So it was just like normal for you to be a 15-year-old. Like what was the initial years
so
like?
Normal at the time. I didn't. Yeah. So again, it's like now I understand why my mother's worried. And I think I worked on my parents for a while. Eventually I was I persuaded them. No, but yeah, it felt very normal at the time, and it was great. It was also great because I actually really liked college, right? And in some sense, it sort of came at the right time for me, where for example, I really appreciated the sort of like liberal arts education and, like the core curriculum and reading sort of core works of political philosophy and literature. And
you did what, econ and?
My majors were math and statistics and economics. But, Columbia has a sort of pretty heavy core curriculum and liberal arts education. And honestly, like, I shouldn't have done all the majors. I should have just, the best courses were sort of the courses where it's like, there's some amazing professor and it's some history class. And it's, that's honestly the thing I would recommend people spend their time on in college.
Was there one professor or class that stood out that way?
There's like a class by Richard Betts on war, peace, and strategy. Adam Too is obviously fantastic, and has written very riveting books. You should have him on the podcast, by the way.
I've tried.
Okay,
I tried.
Yeah, man.
I think you tried for me.
You got to get him on the pod, man. Oh, it'd be so good.
Okay, so then in a couple of years, we were talking to Tyler Cowen recently, and he said that when the way he first encountered you was you wrote this paper on economic growth and existential risk, and he said, when I read it, I couldn't believe that a 17-year-old had written it. I thought if this was an MIT dissertation, I'd be impressed. So you were like, what? How did you go from I guess we were in junior then? You're writing pretty novel economic papers. Why did you get interested in this kind of thing, and what was the process to get in that?
I don't know. I just I get interested in things. In some sense, it's sort of like it feels very natural to me. It's like I get excited about a thing, I read about it, I immerse myself. I think I can I can learn information very quickly and understand it. I think to the paper, I think one actual at least for the way I work, I feel like sort of moments of peak productivity matter much more than sort of average productivity. I think there's some jobs, for like CEO or something, like average productivity really matters. But I think there's sort of I often feel like I have periods of like, there's a couple months where there's sort of an effervescence, and I'm like, and the other times I'm sort of computing stuff in the background. And at some point, like writing the series, this is also kind of similar. And it's just like you write it and it's like, it's really flowing. And that's sort of what ends up mattering.
I think even for CEOs, it might be the case that the peak productivity is very important. There's one of our, following Chatham House rules, one of our friends in a group chat has pointed out how many famous CEOs and founders have been bipolar manic.
Right. Yeah,
which is very much the peak, the call option on your productivity is the most important thing. And you get it by just increasing the volatility through bipolar. Okay, so that's interesting. And so you get interested in economics first. First of all, why economics? Like you could read about anything at this moment. Like if you wanted, you kind of got a slow start on MO, right? you could have, you wasted all these years on econ. There's an alternative world where you're like on the super alignment team at 17 instead of 21 or whatever it was.
Oh no. In some sense, I'm still doing economics, right? What is straight lines on a graph? I'm looking at the log plots and like figuring out what the trends are, and like thinking about the feedback loops and equilibrium arms control dynamics. And I think it is a sort of a way of thinking that I find very useful. Like what Dario and Ilya seeing scaling early. In some sense, that is a sort of very economic way of thinking. And also the sort of physics, kind of like empirical physics. A lot of them are physicists. I think the economists usually can't code well enough, and that's their issue. But I think it's that sort of way of thinking. The other thing is, I thought there were sort of, I thought of a lot of the sort of like core ideas of economics I thought were just beautiful. In some sense, I feel like I was a little duped, where it's like actual econ academia is kind of decadent now. I think that, for example, the paper I wrote, it's sort of, I think the takeaway, it's a long paper, it's 100 pages of math or whatever. I think the core takeaway I can, kind of give the core intuition for in 30 seconds, and it makes sense, and it's like you don't actually need the math.
Yeah.
I think that's the sort of the best pieces of economics are like that, where you do the work, but you do the work to kind of uncover insights that weren't obvious to you before. Once you've done the work, it's like some sort of like mechanism falls out of it that like makes a lot of crisp, intuitive sense that like explains some facts about the world that you can then use in arguments. And I think like a lot of Econ 101 like this, and it's great. A lot of econ in the, in the 50s and the 60s, was like this. And, Chad Jones papers are often like this. I really like Chad Jones' papers for this. I think, why did I ultimately not pursue econ academia was a number of reasons. One of them was Tyler Cowen. He kind of took me aside, and he was kind of like, look, I think you're one of the like top young economists I've ever met, but also you should probably not go to grad school.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, really? I didn't realize that.
Well, yeah. And it was good because he kind of introduced me to the, I don't know, like the Twitter weirdos, or just like, and I think the takeaway from that was kind of, got to move out west one more time.
Wait, Tyler introduced you to the Twitter weirdos?
A little bit, yeah. Or just kind of like the sort of brought,
like the 60-year-old old economist to introduce you to Twitter?
I went from Germany, completely, on the periphery to kind of like, in a US elite institution, and sort of got some vibe of like sort of, you're meritocratic elite, U.S. society, and then sort of, basically this sort of like, there was a sort of trajectory then to being like, look, I, find the true American spirit, I got to come out here. But anyway, the other reason I didn't become an economist was because, or at least econ academia, was because I think sort of econ academia has become a bit decadent. And maybe it's just ideas getting harder to find, and maybe it's sort of things, and the sort of beautiful, simple things have been discovered. But like what are econ papers these days? It's like 200 pages of like empirical analyses on what happened when, like Wisconsin bought, 100,000 more textbooks on like educational outcomes. And I'm really happy that work happened. I think it's important work, but I think it is not covering these sort of like fundamental insights and sort of mechanisms in society. Or, it's like even the theory work is kind of like, here's a really complicated model, and the model spits out, if the Fed does X, then Y happens. And you have no idea why that happened, because it's like gazillion parameters and they're all calibrated in some way, and it's some computer simulation. And you have no idea about the validity, Yeah. So I think the sort of, the most important insights are the ones where you have to do a lot of work to get them, but then there's sort of this crisp intuition.
Yeah. The P versus NP of
sure. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So just going back to your time in college, you say that peak productivity kind of explains this paper and things, but the valedictorian, that's getting straight A's or whatever, is very much average productivity phenomenon, right? So
there's one award for the highest GPA, which I won, but the valedictorian is like among the people which had the highest GPA and then like selected by faculty or something.
Okay, yeah. So it's not just peak productivity.
I generally just love this stuff. I was curious, and I thought it was really interesting, and I loved learning about it, and I loved kind of like, it made sense to me, and it was very natural. And so, I think I'm not. I think one of my faults is I'm not that good at eating glass or whatever. And I think there's some people who are very good at it. I think the sort of moments of peak productivity come when I'm just really excited and engaged and love it. And, if you take the right courses, that's what you got in college. And,
It's the Bruce Banner quote in Avengers. I'm always angry. I'm always excited. I'm always curious. That's why I'm always peak productivity. So it's interesting, by the way, when you were in college, I was also in college. I think you were, despite being a year younger than me, I think you're ahead in college than me, or at least 2 years ahead. And we met around this time.
Yeah.
We also met, I think, through the Tyler Cowen universe.
Yeah.
And it's very insane how small the world is.
Yeah.
I think did I reach out to you? I must have.
Yes.
About,
I don't know. Yeah.
When I had a couple of videos and they had a couple hundred views or something.
Yeah. It's a small world.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the crazy thing about the AI world, right? It's kind of like, it's the same few people at the kind of SF parties, and they're the ones, running the models at DeepMind and, OpenAI and Anthropic and I mean, I think some other friends of ours have mentioned this who are now later in their career and very successful, that, they actually met all the people who are also kind of very successful in Silicon Valley now, like, when they're in their, before their 20s or early 20s. I mean, look, I actually think, and why is it a small world? I mean, I think one of the things is some amount of like, some sort of agency. And I think in a funny way, this is a thing I sort of took away from the sort of Germany experience, where it was, I mean, look, it was crushing. I really didn't like it. And it was such an unusual move to kind of skip grades, and such an unusual move to come to the United States. And, a lot of these things I did were kind of unusual moves. And, there's some amount where just trying to do it, and then it was fine and it worked. That kind of reinforced, you don't just have to kind of conform to what the Overton window is. You can just kind of try to do the thing that seems right to you. And most people can be wrong, and I don't know, things like that. And I think that was kind of a valuable kind of early experience that was sort of formative.
Okay, so after college, what did you do?
I did econ research for a little bit, in Oxford and stuff, and then I worked at Future Fund. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about it.
Okay. Future Fund was a foundation that was funded by Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, we were our own thing. We were based in the Bay. At the time, this was in sort of early 22. It was this just incredibly exciting opportunity, right? It was basically a startup foundation, which is it doesn't come along that often, that we thought would be able to give away billions of dollars, thought would be able to kind of remake how philanthropy is done, from first principles, thought would be able to have this great impact. The causes we focused on were biosecurity, AI, finding exceptional talent and putting them to work on hard problems. And a lot of the stuff we did, I was really excited about. Academics who would usually take 6 months would send us emails this is great, this is so quick and easy, and straightforward. In general, I feel I've often find that with a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of sort of empowerment, kind of removing excuses, making the process easy. You can kind of get people to do great things.
I think on the Future Fund, the thing is context for people who might not realize. Yeah. Not only were you guys planning on deploying billions of dollars, but it was a team of 4 people.
Yeah.
So you at 18 are on a team of 4 people that is in charge of deploying billions of dollars.
Yeah. Future Fund, so that was sort of the heyday, right? And then obviously, when in sort of, November of 22, it was kind of revealed that Sam was this, giant fraud. And from one day to the next, the whole thing collapsed. That was just really tough. Obviously it was devastating. It was devastating, obviously, for the people at their money on FTX, closer to home, all these grantees, we wanted to help them and we thought they were doing amazing projects. And so, but instead of helping them, we ended up saddling them with a giant problem. Personally, it was a startup, right? And so I'd worked 70-hour weeks every week for, basically a year on this to kind of build this up. We're a tiny team. And then from one day to the next, it was all gone. And not just gone, it was associated with this giant fraud. And so, that was incredibly tough. Yeah.
And then were there any signs early on that SBF was?
Yeah, and obviously I didn't know he was a fraud, and the whole, I would have never worked there if I did, and we weren't, we were a separate thing. We weren't working with the business. I do think there were some takeaways for me. I think one takeaway was, I think there's I had this tendency, I think people in general have this tendency to kind of give successful CEOs a pass on their behavior because, they're successful CEOs and that's how they are. And that's just successful CEO things. And, I didn't know Sam Bankman-Fried was a fraud, but I knew SBF and I knew he was extremely risk-taking, right? I knew he was narcissistic. He didn't tolerate disagreement well. Sort of by the end, he and I just didn't get along well. And sort of, I think the reason for that was there were some biosecurity grants he really liked because they were kind of cool and flashy. And at some point I'd kind of run the numbers and it didn't really seem that cost effective. And I pointed that out and he was pretty unhappy about that. And so I knew his character. And I think, I feel one takeaway for me was I think it's really worth paying attention to people's character, and including people you work for and successful CEOs. That can save you a lot of pain down the line.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So after that, FTX implodes and you're out. And then you got into, you went to OpenAI, the super alignment team had just started. I think you were part of the initial team. And so what was the original idea? What was compelling about that for you to join?
Yeah, totally. So, what was the goal of the super alignment team? the alignment team at OpenAI, at other labs sort of like several years ago kind of had done sort of basic research, and they developed RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. And that was sort of ended up being a really successful technique for controlling sort of current generation of AI models. What we were trying to do was basically kind of be the basic research bet to figure out what is the successor to RLHF. And the reason we needed that is, basically, RLHF probably won't scale to superhuman systems. RLHF relies on sort of human raters who kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, like the model said something, it looks fine, looks good to me. At some point, the superhuman models, the superintelligence, it's going to write, a million lines of, crazy complex code. You don't know at all what's going on anymore. And so how do you kind of steer and control these systems? How do you add side constraints? The reason I joined was, I thought this was an important problem, and I thought it was just a really solvable problem, right? I thought this was basically, I still do, even more so do, I think there's a lot of just really promising sort of ML research on alignment, on sort of aligning superhuman systems. And maybe we should talk about that a bit more later. But and then
it was so solvable. You solved it in a year.
Well,
it's all over now.
But anyway, so look, OpenAI wanted to do this like really ambitious effort on alignment, and Ilya was backing it, and I liked a lot of the people there, and so I was really excited, and I was kind of like I think there was a lot of people sort of on alignment. There's always a lot of people kind of making hay about it, and I appreciate people highlighting the importance of the problem, and I was just really into like, let's just try to solve it, let's do the ambitious effort, let's do the Operation Warp Speed for solving alignment, and it seemed like an amazing opportunity to do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now basically the team doesn't exist. I think the head of it has left. Both heads of it have left, Jan and Ilya. That's been the news of the last week. What happened? Why did the thing break down?
I think OpenAI sort of decided to take things in a somewhat different direction.
Meaning what? I mean, that super alignment isn't the best way to frame the... No,
I mean, look, obviously, sort of after the November board events, there were personnel changes. I think Ilya leaving was just incredibly tragic for OpenAI. And, I think some amount of reprioritization, I think some amount of, there's been some reporting on the super alignment compute commitment. There's this 20% compute commitment as part of, how a lot of people were recruited. It's like, we're going to do this ambitious effort in alignment. And, some amount of, not keeping that and deciding to go in a different direction.
Okay, so now Jan has left, Ilya has left. So this team itself has dissolved, but you were the sort of first person who left or was forced to leave. You were, the information reported that you were fired for leaking. What happened? Is this accurate?
Yeah. Look, why don't I tell you what they claim I leaked, and you can tell me what you think. So OpenAI did claim to employees that I was fired for leaking. And I and others have sort of pushed them to say what the leak is. And so here's their response in full. Sometime last year, I had written a sort of brainstorming document on preparedness, on safety and security measures we need in the future on the path to AGI. And I shared that with 3 external researchers for feedback. So that's it. That's the leak. I think for context, it was totally normal at OpenAI at the time to share sort of safety ideas with external researchers for feedback. It happened all the time. The doc was sort of my ideas. Before I shared it, I reviewed it for anything sensitive. The internal version had a reference to a future cluster, but I redacted that for the external copy. There's a link in there to some slides of mine, internal slides. But that was a dead link to the external people I shared it with. The slides weren't shared with them. And so look, obviously I pressed them to sort of tell me what is the confidential information in this document. And what they came back with was a line in the doc about planning for AGI by 27, 28, and not setting timelines for preparedness. I wrote this doc, a couple months after the super alignment announcement. We had put out, this sort of 4-year planning horizon. I didn't think that planning horizon was sensitive. It's the sort of thing Sam says publicly all the time. I think sort of John said it on the podcast,
he said it on my podcast
a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, so that's it.
That's it? So that seems pretty thin for, if the cause was leaking, that seems pretty thin. Was there anything else to it?
Yeah, so that was the leaking claim. I can say a bit more about sort of what happened in the firing. So one thing was, last year I had written a internal memo about OpenAI security. I thought it was, egregiously insufficient. I thought it wasn't sufficient to protect, the theft of model weights or key algorithmic secrets from foreign actors. So I wrote this memo. I shared it with a few colleagues, a couple members of leadership, who sort of mostly said it was helpful. But then, a couple weeks later, a sort of major security incident occurred. And that prompted me to share the memo with a couple members of the board. And so after I did that, days later, it was made very clear to me that leadership was very unhappy with me having shared this memo with the board. Apparently the board had hassled leadership about security. And then I got sort of an official HR warning for this memo, for sharing it with the board. The HR person told me it was racist to worry about CCP espionage. And they said it was sort of unconstructive. And look, I think I probably wasn't at my most diplomatic. I definitely could have been more politically savvy. But I thought it was a really, really important issue. And, the security incident had made me really worried. Anyway, and so I guess the reason I bring this up is when I was fired, it was sort of made very explicit that the security memo was a major reason for my being fired. I think it was something like, the reason that this is a firing and not a warning is because of the security memo.
But you sharing it with the board?
The warning I'd gotten for the security memo. Anyway, and I mean, some other, what might also be helpful context is the sort of questions they asked me when they fired me. So, this was a bit over a month ago. I was pulled, aside for a chat with a lawyer, that quickly turned very adversarial. And, the questions were all about my views on AI progress, on AGI, on the level of security appropriate for AGI, on, whether government should be involved in AGI, on, whether I and Super Alignment were loyal to the company, on what I was up to during the OpenAI board events, things like that. And then they chatted to a couple of my colleagues, and then they came back and told me I was fired. And they'd gone through all of my digital artifacts from the time at my time at OpenAI, messages, docs, and that's when they found the leak. And so anyway, so the main claim they made was this leaking allegation. That's what they told employees. The security memo. There's a couple other allegations they threw in. One thing they said was that I was unforthcoming during the investigation because I didn't initially remember who I had shared the doc with, the sort of preparedness brainstorming doc, only that I had sort of spoken to some external researchers about these ideas. And, look, the doc was over 6 months old. I'd spent a day on it. It was a Google Doc I shared with my OpenAI email. It wasn't a screenshot or anything I was trying to hide. It simply didn't stick because it was such a non-issue. And then they also claimed that I was engaging on policy in a way that they didn't like. And so what they cited there was that I had spoken to a couple external researchers, somebody at a think tank, about my view that AGI would become a government project, as we discussed. In fact, I was speaking to lots of sort of people in the field about that at the time. I thought it was a really important thing to think about. Yeah. Anyway, and so they found a DM that I'd written to like a friendly colleague, 5 or 6 months ago, where I relayed this, and they cited that. I had thought it was well within OpenAI norms to kind of talk about high-level issues on the future of AGI with external people in the field. So anyway, so that's what they alleged. That's what happened. I've spoken to kind of a few dozen former colleagues about this, since. I think the sort of universal reaction is kind of like, that's insane. I was sort of surprised as well. I had been promoted just a few months before. I think Ilya's comment for the promotion case at the time was something like, Leopold's amazing. We're lucky to have him. But look, I mean, I think the thing I understand, and I think in some sense is reasonable, is like, I think I ruffled some feathers, and I think I was probably kind of annoying at times. It's like security stuff, and I kind of like repeatedly raised that, and maybe not always in the most diplomatic way. I didn't sign the employee letter during the board events, despite pressure to do so.
And you were one of like 8 people or something?
Not that many people. Yeah. I guess I think the sort of 2 senior most people who didn't sign were Andre and Jan, who've both since left. And on the letter, by the way, by the time on sort of Monday morning, when that letter was going around, I think probably it was appropriate for the board to resign. I think they'd kind of like lost too much credibility and trust with the employees. But I thought the letter had a bunch of issues. I mean, I think one of them was it just didn't call for an independent board. I think it's sort of like basics of corporate governance to have an independent board. Anyway, it's other things. In sort of other discussions, I pressed leadership for sort of OpenAI to abide by its public commitments. I raised a bunch of tough questions about whether it was consistent with the OpenAI mission and consistent with the national interest to sort of partner with authoritarian dictatorships to build the core infrastructure for AGI. So, look, it's a free country, right? That's what I love about this country. We talked about it. And so they have no obligation to keep me on staff. And, I think in some sense, I think it would have been perfectly reasonable for them to come to me and say, look, we're taking the company in a different direction. We disagree with your point of view. We don't trust you enough to sort of toe the company line anymore. And, thank you so much for your work at OpenAI, but I think it's time to part ways. I think that would have made sense. I think, we did start sort of materially diverging on sort of views on important issues. I'd come in very excited and aligned with OpenAI, but that sort of changed over time. And look, I think there would have been a very amicable way to part ways. And I think it's a bit of a shame that this is the way it went down. All that being said, I think, I really want to emphasize there's just a lot of really incredible people at OpenAI, and it was an incredible privilege to work with them. And overall, I'm just extremely grateful for my time there.
When you left, now there's been reporting about an NDA that former employees have to sign in order to have access to their vested equity. Did you sign such NDA?
No. My situation was a little different in that I was basically right before my cliff. But then, they still offered me the equity. But I didn't want to sign the non-disparagement. Freedom is priceless. So.
And how much was the equity?
It's like close to $1 million.
So it was definitely a thing you and others were aware of, that this is like a choice that OpenAI is explicitly offering you.
Yeah.
And presumably the person on OpenAI's staff knew that we're offering them equity, but they had to sign this NDA that has these conditions that you can't, for example, give the kind of statements about your thoughts on AGI and OpenAI that you're giving on this podcast right now.
Look, I don't know what the whole situation is. I certainly think sort of vested equity is pretty rough if you're conditioning that onto an NDA. It might be a somewhat different situation if it's a sort of severance agreement.
Right. Yeah. But an OpenAI employee who had signed it presumably could not give the podcast that you're giving today.
Quite plausibly not. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, so analyzing the situation here, I guess if you were to, the board thing is really tough, because if you were trying to defend them, you would say, well, listen, you were just kind of going outside the regular chain of command, and maybe there's a point there. Although the way in which the person from HR thinks that you have an adversarial relationship with, or you're supposed to have an adversarial relationship with the board, where to give the board some information which is relevant to whether OpenAI is fulfilling its mission and whether it can do that in a better way is part of the leak, as if the board is supposed to ensure that OpenAI is following its mission is some sort of external actor. That seems pretty... I
mean, to be clear, the leak allegation was just that sort of document I shared for feedback. This is just sort of a separate thing that they cited, and they said I wouldn't have been fired if not for the security memo.
They said you wouldn't have been fired.
They said the reason this is a firing and not a warning is because of the warning you had gotten for the security memo.
Oh. Before you left, the incidents with the board happened, where Sam was fired and then rehired as CEO, and now he's on the board. Now... Ilya and Jan, who are the heads of the super alignment team, and Ilya, who is a co-founder of OpenAI, obviously the most significant in terms of stature member of OpenAI from a research perspective, they've left. Seems like, especially with regards to super alignment stuff and just generally with OpenAI, a lot of this sort of personnel drama has happened over the last few months. What's going on?
Yeah, there's a lot of drama about OpenAI. So why is there so much drama? I think there would be a lot less drama if all OpenAI claimed to be was sort of building ChatGPT or building business software. I think where a lot of the drama comes from is, OpenAI really believes they're building AGI, right? And it's not just, a claim that they make for marketing purposes, whatever. There's this report that Sam is raising, $7 trillion for chips. And it's like, that stuff only makes sense if you really believe in AGI. And so I think what gets people sometimes is sort of the cognitive dissonance between sort of really believing in AGI, but then sort of not taking some of the other implications seriously. This is going to be incredibly powerful technology, both for good and for bad. And that implicates really important issues like the national security issues we spoke about. Like, are you protecting the secrets from the CCP? Like, does America control the core AGI infrastructure, or does it, a Middle Eastern dictator control the core AGI infrastructure? And then, I think the thing that, really gets people is the sort of tendency to kind of then make commitments. And sort of like, they say they take these issues really seriously, they make big commitments on them, but then sort of frequently don't follow through, right? So, again, as mentioned, there's this commitment around super alignment compute, sort of 20% of compute for this long-term safety research effort. And I think, you and I could have a totally reasonable debate about what is the appropriate level of compute for super alignment. But that's not really the issue. The issue is that this commitment was made, and it was used to recruit people, and it was very public, and it was made because there's a recognition that there would always be something more urgent than a long-term safety research effort, like some new product or whatever. And but then in fact they just really didn't keep the commitment, and so there was always something more urgent than long-term safety research. I think another example of this is when I raised these issues about security. They would tell me, security is our number one priority. But then, invariably when it came time to sort of invest serious resources, when it came time to make trade-offs, to sort of take some pretty basic measures, security would not be prioritized. And so, I think it's the cognitive dissonance, and I think it's the sort of unreliability that causes a bunch of the drama.
So let's zoom out, talk about a big part of the story, and also a big motivation of the way in which it must proceed with regards to geopolitics and everything, is that once you have the AGI, pretty soon after you proceed to ASI, because superintelligence, because you have these AGIs which can function as researchers into further AI progress. And within a matter of years, maybe less, you go to something that is like superintelligence. And at the high, and then from there, then you do according to your story, do all this research and development into robotics and pocket nukes and whatever other crazy shit.
Yeah.
But at a high, okay, but there's, I'm skeptical of this story for many reasons.
Yes.
At a high level, it's not clear to me that this input-output model of research is how things actually happen in research. We can look at economy-wide, right? Patrick Hollis and others have made this point that compared to 100 years ago, we have 100x more researchers in the world. It's not like progress is happening 100x faster. So it's clearly not the case that you can just pump in more population into research and you get higher research on the other end. I don't know why it would be different for the AI researchers themselves.
Okay, great. So this is getting into some good stuff. This is I have kind of classic disagreement I have with Patrick and others. All right, so obviously inputs matter, right? So it's like the United States produces a lot more scientific and technological progress than, Liechtenstein, right? Or Switzerland. And even if I made, Patrick Collison dictator of like Liechtenstein or Switzerland, and Patrick Collison was able to implement his utopia of ideal institutions, keeping the talent pool fixed. He's not able to do some crazy high school immigration thing or whatever, some crazy genetic breeding scheme or whatever he wants to do. Keeping the talent pool fixed, but amazing institutions. I claim that still, even if you made Patrick Collison dictator of Switzerland, maybe you get some factor, but Switzerland is not going to be able to outcompete the United States in scientific and technological progress. Obviously, magnitudes matter. Okay. Now
I'm not sure I agree with this. Okay. There's been many examples in history where you have small groups of people who are part of Bell Labs or Skunkworks or something. There's a couple hundred researchers. OpenAI, right? A couple hundred researchers. They do
highly selected though, right? It's like saying
well, that's part of why Patrick Collison as a dictator is going to do a good job of this.
Well, yes, if he can highly select all the best AI researchers in the world, he might only need a few hundred. But if that's the talent pool. It's like you have the 300 best AI researchers in the world.
But there has been, it's not the case that from 100 years to now, there haven't been, the population has increased massively. A lot of the work, in fact, you would expect the density of talent to have increased in the sense that malnutrition and other kinds of poverty, whatever, that have debilitated past talent at the same sort of level is no longer debilitated in the same way.
To the 100x point, right? So I don't know if it's 100x. I think it's easy to inflate these things. It's probably at least 10x. And so people are sometimes like, come on, ideas haven't gotten that much harder to find. Why would you have needed this 10x increase in research effort? Whereas to me, I think this is an extremely natural story. And why is it a natural story? It's a straight line on a log-log plot. This is sort of a deep learning researcher's dream, right? And what is this log-log plot? On the x-axis, you have log cumulative research effort. On the y-axis, you have log GDP or ohms of algorithmic progress, or log transistors per square inch, or in the sort of experience curve for solar, kind of like whatever the log of the price for a gigawatt of solar. And it's extremely natural for that to be a straight line. This is sort of a class. Yeah, it's a classic. And it's basically the first thing is very easy. Then basically you have to have log increments of cumulative research effort to find the next thing. And so in some sense, I think this is a natural story. Now, one objection kind of people then make is like, oh, isn't it suspicious, right? That like ideas, well, we increased research effort 10x, and ideas also just got 10x harder to find, and so it perfectly, equilibrates. And to there, I say, it's an equilibrium. It's an endogenous equilibrium, right? So it's like, isn't it a coincidence that supply equals demand, and the market clears, right? And that's and same thing here, right? So it's ideas how much ideas have gotten harder to find is a function of how much progress you've made. And then, what the overall growth rate has been is a function of how much ideas have gotten harder to find in ratio to how much you've been able to like increase research effort. What is the sort of growth of log cumulative research effort? So in some sense, I think the story is sort of like fairly natural. And you see this not just economy wide, you see it in kind of experience curve for all sorts of individual technologies. So I think there's some process like this. I think it's totally plausible that, institutions have gotten worse by some factor. Obviously, there's some sort of exponent of diminishing returns on more people, right? So like serial time is better than just parallelizing. But still, I think it's like clearly inputs matter.
I agree. But if the coefficient of how fast they diminish as you grow the input is high enough, then in the abstract, the fact that inputs matter isn't that relevant. Okay, so I mean, we're talking at a very high level, but just like take it down to the actual concrete thing here. OpenAI has a staff of at most low hundreds who are directly involved in the algorithmic progress in future models. If it was really the case that you could just arbitrarily scale this number and you could have much faster algorithmic progress, and that would result in much better AIs for OpenAI, basically. Then it's not clear why OpenAI doesn't just go out and hire every single person with 150 IQ, of which there are hundreds of thousands in the world. And my story there is there's transaction costs to managing all these people that don't just go away if you have a bunch of AIs, that these tasks aren't easy to parallelize. And I think I'm not sure how you would explain the fact of like, why doesn't OpenAI go on a recruiting binge of every single genius in the world?
Okay, great. So let's talk about the OpenAI example, and let's talk about the automated AI researchers. So, I mean, in the OpenAI case, I mean, just kind of like look at the inflation of like AI researcher salaries over the last year. I mean, I think like, I don't know what it is, 4x, 5x. It's kind of crazy. So they're clearly really trying to recruit the best AI researchers in the world. And, I don't know, they do find the best AI researchers in the world. And I think my response to your thing is like, almost all of these 150 IQ people, if you just hired them tomorrow, they wouldn't be good AI researchers. They wouldn't be an Alec Radford.
But they're willing to make investments that take years to pan out in the form. The data centers they're buying right now will come online in 2026 or something. Why wouldn't they be able to make every 150 IQ person? Some of them won't work out. Some of them won't have the traits we like. But some of them by 2026 will be amazing AI researchers. Why aren't they making that bet?
Yeah, and so sometimes this happens, right? Like smart physicists have been really good at AI research. It's like all the Anthropic co-founders.
But like if you talk to, I had Dario on the podcast. They have this very careful policy of like, we're not gonna just hire arbitrarily. We're gonna be extremely selective.
So we make sure training is not as easily scalable, right? So training is very hard. If you just hired 100,000 people, it's like, you couldn't train them all. It'd be really hard to train them all. You wouldn't be doing any AI research. Like, there's huge costs to bringing on a new person, training them. This is very different with AIs, right? And I think it's really important to talk about the sort of like advantages the AIs will have. So it's like, training, right? It's like, what does it take to be an Alec Radford? You need to be a really good engineer, right? The AIs, they're going to be an amazing engineer. They're going to be amazing at coding. You can just train them to do that. They need to have, not just be a good engineer, but have really good research intuitions and like really understand deep learning. And this is stuff that, Alec Radford or, somebody like him has acquired over years of research, over just like being deeply immersed in deep learning, having tried lots of things himself and failed. The AIs, they're going to be able to read every research paper I've written, every experiment ever run at the lab, like gain the intuitions from all of this. They're going to be able to learn in parallel from all of each other's experiences. I don't know what else. It's like, what does it take to be an Alec Radford? Well, there's a sort of cultural acclimation aspect of it, right? If you hire somebody new, there's like politicking, maybe they don't fit in. Well, in the AI case, you just make replicas, right? There's a like motivation aspect for it, right? So it's like, Alec, if I could just like duplicate Alec Radford, and before I run every experiment, I have him spend like, a decade's worth of human time, like double checking the code and thinking really carefully about it. I mean, first of all, I don't have that many Alec Radfords, and he wouldn't care, and he would not be motivated. But the AIs, it can just be like, look, I have 100 million of you guys. I'm just going to put you on, just like really making sure this code is correct. There are no bugs. This experiment is thought through. Every hyperparameter is correct. Final thing I'll say is, the 100 million human equivalent AI researchers, that is just a way to visualize it. So that doesn't mean you're going to have literally 100 million copies. So there's trade-offs you can make between serial speed and in parallel. So you might make the trade-off is, look, we're going to run them at 10x, 100x serial speed. It's going to result in fewer tokens overall because of sort of inherent trade-offs. But then we have, I don't know what the numbers would be, but then we have 100,000 of them running at 100x human speed and thinking, and there's other things you can do on coordination. They can kind of like share latent space, attend to each other's context. There's basically this huge range of possibilities of things you can do. The 100 million thing is more, another illustration of this is, if you I run the math in my series, and it's basically, 27, 28, you have this automated AI researcher. You're going to be able to generate an entire internet's worth of tokens every single day. So there's clearly sort of a huge amount of like intellectual work they can do.
I think the analogous thing there is today we generate more patents in a year than during the actual physics revolution in the early 20th century. They were generating across like half a century or something. And are you making more physics progress in a year today than we were? So you're going to generate all these tokens. Are you generating as much codified knowledge as humanity has been able to generate in the initial creation of the internet?
Internet tokens are usually final output, right? Sort of, a lot of these tokens, if we talked about the unhobbling, right? And I think of a kind of like, a GPDN token is sort of like one token of my internal monologue, right? And so that's how I do this math on human equivalence. It's like 100 tokens a minute, and then, humans working for X hours, and, what is the equivalent there?
I think this goes back to something we were talking about earlier, where why haven't we seen the huge revenues from... People often ask this question that if you took GPT-4 back 10 years and you showed people this, they think this is going to automate. This is already automated half the jobs. And so there's a sort of a modus ponens, modus tollens here, where part of the explanation is like, oh, it's like just on the verge, you need to do these unhobblings. And part of that is probably true. But there is another lesson to learn there, which is that just looking at face value at a set of abilities, there's probably more sort of hobblings that you don't realize that are hidden behind the scenes. And I think the same will be true of the AGIs that you have running as AI researchers. I think a lot of things
basically agree, right? I think my story here is like, I talk about, I think there's going to be some long tail, right? And so maybe it's like, 26, 27, you have like the proto-automated engineer, and it's really good at engineering. He doesn't have the research intuition yet. You don't quite know how to put them to work. But the sort of even the underlying pace of AI progress is already so fast, right? In 3 years from not being able to do any kind of like math at all to now crushing these math competitions. And so you have the initial thing in like 26, 27, maybe the sort of it's an automated research engineer. It speeds you up by 2x. You go through a lot more progress in that year. By the end of the year, you figured out like the remaining kind of unhobblings. You've like got a smarter model, and maybe then that thing, or maybe it's 2 years, and that thing just like that thing really can automate 100%. And again, they don't need to be doing everything. They don't need to be making coffee. They don't need to like, maybe there's a bunch of, tacit knowledge in a bunch of other fields. But, AI researchers at AI labs really know the job of an AI researcher. And it's in some sense, it's a sort of, there's lots of clear metrics. It's all virtual. There's code. It's things you can kind of develop and train for.
So, I mean, another thing is, how do you actually manage a million AI researchers? Humans, the sort of comparative ability we have that we've been especially trained for is like working in teams. And despite this fact, we have, for thousands of years, we've been learning about how we work together in groups. And despite this, management is a clusterfuck, right? It's like most companies are badly managed. It's really hard to do this stuff. For AIs, the sort of like, we talk about AGI, but it'll be some bespoke set of abilities, some of which will be higher than humans, some of which will be at human level. And so it'll be some bundle, and we'll need to figure out how to put these bundles together with their human overseers, with the equipment and everything. And the idea that as soon as you get the bundle, you'll figure out how to get just shove millions of them together and manage them, I'm just very skeptical of. Like any other revolution, technological revolution in history has been very piecemeal, much more piecemeal than you would expect on paper if you just thought about what is the Industrial Revolution. Well, we dig up coal that powers the steam engines. We use the steam engines to run these railroads. That helps us get more coal out. And there's sort of like Factorio story you can tell where in like a 6 hours you can be pumping thousands of times more coal. But in real life, it takes centuries often, right? In fact, the electrification, there's this famous study about how initially to electrify factories, it was decades before after electricity to change from the pulleys and water wheel based system that we had for steam engines to one that works with more spread out electrical motors and everything. I think this will be the same kind of thing. It might take like decades to actually get millions of AI researchers to work together.
Okay, great. This is great. Okay, so a few responses to that. First of all, I mean, I totally agree with the kind of like real world bottlenecks type of thing. I think this is sort of, you know, I think it's easy to underrate. You know, basically what we're doing is we're removing the labor constraint. We automate labor and we like kind of exploit technology, but you know, there's still lots of other bottlenecks in the world. And so I think this is part of why the story is it kind of like starts pretty narrow at the thing where you don't have these bottlenecks. And then only over time, as we let it kind of expands to sort of broader areas. AI, this is part of why I think it's like initially this sort of AI research explosion, right? It's like AI research doesn't run into these real world bottlenecks. It doesn't require you to like plow a field or dig up coal. It's just, you're just doing AI research. The other thing about
I love how like in your model, the AI research, it's not complicated like about flipping a burger. It's just AI research.
Well, no, but I mean, this is because people make these arguments of like, oh, you know, AGI won't do anything because it can't flip a burger. I'm like, yeah, it won't be able to flip a burger, but it's going to be able to do algorithmic progress. You know, and then when it does algorithmic progress, it'll figure out how to flip a burger, you know, and then we'll have the burger flipping, you know, robot. You know, look, the other thing is about, you know, again, the sort of quantities are a lower bound, right? So it's like, this is just like, we can definitely run 100 million of these. Probably what will happen is one of the first things we're going to try to figure out is how to like, again, run like, you know, translate quantity into quality, right? And so it's like, even at the baseline rate of progress, you're like, quickly getting smarter and smarter systems, right? If we said it was like, you know, 4 years between the preschooler and the high schooler, right? So I think, you know, pretty quickly, you know, there's probably some like simple algorithmic changes you find, you know, if instead of one Alec Bradford, you have 100, you know, you don't even need 100 million. And then you get even smarter systems. And now these systems are, you know, they're capable of sort of creative, complicated behavior you don't understand. Maybe there's some way to like use all this test time compute in a more unified way rather than all these parallel copies. And, you know, so there won't just be quantitatively superhuman. They'll pretty quickly become kind of qualitatively superhuman. You know, it's sort of like, look, like, you know, you're a high school student, you're like trying to wrap your mind around kind of standard physics. And then there's some like super smart professor who is like quantum physics, it all makes sense to him. And you're just like, what is going on? And sort of, I think pretty quickly you kind of enter that regime. Just given even the underlying pace of AI progress, but even more quickly than that, because you have this sort of accelerated force of now this automated AI research.
I agree that over time you would, I'm not denying that ASI is a thing that's possible.
Not that much, you know?
I'm just like, you know, how is this happening in a year? Like okay, first of all.
So I think the story is sort of like, basically, I think it's a little bit more continuous, you know, right? Like, I think already, you know, like I talked about, you know, 25, 26, you're basically going to have models as good as a college graduate. And, you know, I don't know where the unhobbling is going to be, but I think it's plausible that even then you have kind of the proto-automated engineer. So I think there is a bit of like a smear, kind of an AGI smear or whatever, where it's like there's sort of unhobblings that you're missing. There's kind of like ways of connecting them you're missing. There's like some level of intelligence you're missing. But then at some point you are going to get the thing that is like an 100% automated Alec Bradford. And once you have that, you know, things really take off, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to the unhobblings.
Yeah.
We're going to get a bunch of models by the end of the year. Is there something, let's suppose we didn't get some capacity by the end of the year.
Yeah.
Is there some such capacity which lacking would suggest that AI progress is going to take longer than you are projecting?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two kind of key things. There's the unhobbling and there's the data wall, right? I think we should talk about the data wall for a moment. I think the data wall is, you know, even though kind of like all of this stuff has been about, you know, crazy AI progress, I think the data wall is actually sort of underrated. I think there's like a real scenario where we just stagnate.
Yeah.
You know, because we've been running this tailwind of just like, it's really easy to bootstrap and you just do unsupervised learning next token prediction. It learns these amazing world models, like bam, you know, great model. And you just got to buy some more compute, you know, do some simple efficiency changes. You know, and again, like so much of deep learning, all these like big gains on efficiency have been like pretty dumb things, right? Like, you know, you add a normalization layer, you know, you fix the scaling laws, you know, and these already have been huge things, let alone kind of like obvious ways in which these models aren't good yet. Anyway, so data wall, big deal. You know, I don't know, some like put some numbers on this, you know, some like dedupe common crawl, online is like, 30 trillion tokens, Llama 3 trained on 15 trillion tokens. So you're basically already using all the data.
Yeah.
And then, you can get somewhat further by repeating it. So there's an academic paper by, Boaz Barak and some others that does scaling laws for this. And they're basically like, yeah, you can repeat it sometime. After 16 times of repetition, it's just like returns basically go to zero. You're just completely screwed. And so I don't know, say you can get another 10x on data from say like Llama 3 and GPT-4, Llama 3 is already kind of like at the limit of all the data. Maybe you can get 10x more by repeating data. I don't know, maybe that's like at most a 100x better model than GPT-4, which is like, 100x effective compute from GPT-4 is, not that much. If you do half an order of magnitude a year of compute, half an order of magnitude a year of algorithmic progress, that's kind of like 2 years from GPT-4. Yeah. So, GPT-4 finished pre-training in 22, 24. So I think one thing that really matters, I think we won't quite know by the end of the year, but 25, 26, are we cracking the data wall?
Okay, so suppose we had 3 orders of magnitude less data in Common Crawl on the internet than we just happen to have now. And for decades, the internet, other things, we've been rapidly increasing the stock of data that humanity has. Is it your view that for contingent reasons, we just happen to have enough data to train models that are just powerful enough at 4.5 level where they can kick off the self-play RL loop? Or is it just that we, if it had been 3 ohms higher, then progress would have been slightly faster? In that world, we would have been looking back at like, oh, how hard it would have been to like kick off the RL explosion with just 4.5, but we would have figured it out. And then so in this world, we would have gotten to GPT-3 and then we'd had to kick off some sort of RL explosion. But we would have still figured it out. The sort of we didn't just like luck out on the amount of data we happen to have in the world.
I mean, 3 ohms is pretty rough, right? Like 3 ohms, if less data means like 6 ohms smaller, 6 ohms like less compute model and chinchilla scaling laws. It's basically like capping out at like GPT-2. Barely better. So I think that would be really rough. I think you do make an interesting point about the contingency. I guess earlier we were talking about this sort of like when in the sort of human trajectory are you able to learn from yourself? And so, if we go with that analogy, again, like if you'd only gotten the preschooler model, it can't learn from itself. If you'd only gotten the elementary schooler model, it can't learn from itself. And, maybe GPT-4, smart high schooler is really where it starts. Ideally, you have a somewhat better model, then it really is able to kind of like learn from itself or learn by itself. So I think there's an interesting, I think maybe 1 ohm less data, I would be like more iffy, but maybe still doable. Yeah, I think I would feel chiller if we had, like 1 or 2.
It would be an interesting exercise to get probability distributions of AGI contingent done across the ohms of data. Okay. The thing that makes me skeptical of this story is that it totally makes sense why pre-training works so well. These other things, there are stories of, in principle, why they ought to work. Like humans can learn this way and so on. And maybe they're true, but I worry that a lot of this case is based on sort of first principles evaluation of how learning happens that fundamentally we don't understand how humans learn. And maybe there's some key thing we're missing. On the sort of sample efficiency, humans actually, maybe there's, you say, well, the fact that these things are way less sample efficient in terms of learning than humans are suggests that there's a lot of room for improvement. Another perspective is that we are just on the wrong path altogether, right? That's why there's a sample inefficient when it comes to pre-training. So, I'm just like, there's a lot of like first principles arguments stacked on top of each other where you get these unhobblings and then you get to AGI. Then because of these reasons why you can stack all these things on top of each other, you get to ASI. And I'm worried that there's too many steps of this sort of first principles thinking.
I mean, we'll see, right? I mean, on the sort of sample efficiency thing, again, sort of first principles, but I think, again, there's this clear sort of missing middle. And so, and sort of like, people hadn't been trying. Now people are really trying, and so it's sort of, I think often again in deep learning, something like the obvious thing works. And there's a lot of details to get right. So it might take some time, but it's now where people are really trying. So I think we get a lot of signal in the next couple of years. On unhobbling, I mean, what is the signal on unhobbling that I think would be interesting? I think the question is basically like, are you making progress on this test time compute thing, right? Like, is this thing able to think longer horizon than just a couple hundred tokens, right? That was unlocked by chain of thought.
And on that point in particular, the many people who have longer timelines have come on the podcast have made the point that the way to train this long horizon RL, it's not, I mean, I earlier talking about like, well, they can think for 5 minutes, but not for longer. but it's not because they can't physically output an hour's worth of tokens.
Yeah.
It's just really, at least from what I understand, or what they say.
Right? Like even like Gemini has like 1 million in context, and the 1 million of context is actually great for consumption, and it solves one important on hobbling, which is the sort of onboarding problem, right? Which is, a new coworker, in your first 5 minutes, like a new smart high school intern, first 5 minutes, not useful at all. A month in, much more useful, right? Because they've like looked at the mono repo and understand how the code works, and they've read your internal docs. And so being able to put that in context, great, solves this onboarding problem. But they're not good at sort of the production of 1 million tokens yet. Yeah.
Right. But on the production of 1 million tokens, there's no public evidence that there's some easy loss function where you can...
GPT-4 has gotten a lot better since... It's actually... So the GPT-4 gains since launch, I think, are a huge indicator that there's like... so you talked about this with John on the podcast. John said this was mostly post-training gains.
Right.
If you look at the sort of LM-SIS scores, it's like 100 ELO or something. It's like a bigger gap than between Claude 3 Opus and Claude 3 Haiku. And the price difference between those is 60x.
But it's not more agentic. It's like better in the same chatbot way.
Math, right? Like, it went from like, 40% to 70% at math.
The crux is like whether like be able to...
No, but I think it indicates that clearly there's stuff to be done on hobbling. I think the interesting question is like this time a year from now, is there a model that is able to think for like, a few thousand tokens coherently, cohesively, agentically? And I think probably there's, again, this is what I'd feel better if we had an or two more data, because it's like the scaling just gives you this sort of like tailwind, right? Where like, for example, tools, right? Tools, I think, talking to people who try to make things work with tools, actually sort of GPT-4 is really when tools start to work. And it's like, you can kind of make them work with GPT 3.5, but it's just really tough. And so it's just like having GPT-4, you can kind of help it learn tools in a much easier way. And so just a bit more tailwind from scaling. And then, does I don't know if it'll work, but it's a key question.
Okay, I think it's a good place to sort of close that part where we know what the crux is and what the progress, what evidence that would look like. On the AGI to superintelligence, maybe it's a case that the gains are really easy right now and you can just sort of let loose an Alec Radford, give him a compute budget, and he comes out the other end with something that is an additive, like change this part of the code, this is a compute multiplier, change this other part. What other parts of the world... Okay, maybe here's an interesting way to ask this. How many other domains in the world are like this where you think you could get the equivalent of in 1 year, you just throw enough intelligence across multiple instances and you just come out the other end with something that is remarkably decades, centuries ahead? Like, you start off with no flight, and then you have the Wright brothers, 1 million instances of GPT-6, and you come out the other end with Starlink. Like, is that your model of how things work?
I think you're exaggerating the timelines a little bit, but I think a decade's worth of progress in a year or something. I think that's a reasonable prompt. So I think this is where basically the sort of automated AI researcher comes in, because it gives you this enormous headwind on all the other stuff, right? So it's like, you automate AI research with your sort of automated Alec Radfords. You come out the other end, you've done another 5 ooms, you have a thing that is like vastly smarter. Not only is it vastly smarter, you've been able to make it good at everything else, right? You're solving robotics. The robots are important, right? Because like for a lot of other things, you do actually need to like try things in the physical world. I mean, I don't know, maybe you can do a lot in simulation. Those are the really quick worlds. I don't know if you saw the like last NVIDIA GTC, and it was all about the like digital twins and just like having all your manufacturing processes in simulation. And like, I don't know, like again, if you have these like, super intelligent, like cognitive workers, like can they just like make simulations of everything, kind of AlphaFold style, and then, make a lot of progress in simulation possible. But I also just think you're going to get the robots. Again, I agree about like, there are a lot of real world bottlenecks, right? And so, I don't know. It's quite possible that we're going to have, crazy drone swarms, but also, like lawyers and doctors still need to be humans because of like, regulation. But, I think, you kind of start narrowly, you broaden, and then the worlds in which you kind of let them loose, which again, because of, I think, these competitive pressures, we will have to let them loose in some degree on, various national security applications. I think like quite rapid progress is possible. The other thing though is it's sort of, basically in the sort of an explosion after, there's kind of 2 components. There's the A, right, in the production function, the like growth of technology. And that's massively accelerated by, now you have a billion super intelligent scientists and engineers and technicians, superbly competent at everything. You also just automated labor, right? And so it's like, even without the whole technological explosion thing, you have this industrial explosion, at least if you let them loose, which is like, now you can just build, you can cover Nevada, and like, you start with one robot factory that's producing more robots. And basically this like just a cumulative process, because you've taken labor out of the equation.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
Although when you increase the K or the L without increasing the A, you can look at the Soviet Union or China, where they rapidly increased inputs.
Yeah.
And that does have the effect of being geopolitically game-changing, where it is remarkable. Like you go to Shanghai over a course of decades.
They throw out these crazy cities in a decade, right?
And that's, the closest thing to like people talk about 30% growth rates or whatever from
Asian
AI.
Tigers, 10%. So it's totally possible, right? And that's
without productivity gains, it's not like the Industrial Revolution, where like from the perspective of you're looking at a system from the outside, your goods have gotten cheaper, or they can manufacture more things, but it's not like the next century is coming at you.
Yeah, it's both. It's both that are important. The other thing I'll say is like, all of this stuff, I think the magnitudes are really, really important, right? So, we talked about a 10x of research effort, or maybe 10, 30x over a decade. Even without any kind of like self-improvement type loop, we talk even in the sort of GPT-4 to AGI story, we're talking about an order of magnitude of effective compute increase a year, right? Half an order of magnitude of compute, half an order of magnitude of algorithmic progress. That sort of translates into effective compute. And so you're doing a 10x a year, right? Basically on your labor force, right? So it's like, it's a radically different world if you're doing a 10x or a 30x in a century versus a 10x a year on your labor force. So the magnitudes really matter. They also really matter on the sort of intelligence explosion, right? So like just the automated AI research part. So, one story you could tell there is like, well, ideas get harder to find, right? Algorithmic progress is going to get harder. Yeah, right now you have the easy wins, but in like 4 or 5 years, there'll be fewer easy wins. And so the sort of automated AI researchers are just going to be what's necessary to just keep it going, right? Because it's gotten harder. Right. But that's sort of, it's like a really weird knife edge assumption in economics where you assume it's just
But enough. Isn't that the equilibrium story you were just telling with why the economy as a whole has 2% economic growth? Because you just proceed on the equal. I guess you're saying by the time we get to the equilibrium
here is it's like way faster, at least, and it's at least, and it depends on the sort of exponents, but it's basically, it's the increase. It's like, suppose you need to like 10x effective research effort in AI research in the last, 4 or 5 years to keep the pace of progress. We're not just getting a 10x, you're getting, a million X or 100,000x. There's just the magnitudes really matter. And the magnitudes just basically, one way to think about this is that you have kind of two exponentials. You have your sort of like normal economy that's growing at 2% a year, and you have your like AI economy, and that's going at like 10x a year, and it's starting out really small, but sort of eventually it's way faster, and eventually it's going to overtake, right? And even if you have, you can almost sort of just do the simple revenue extrapolation, right? If you think your AI economy, that has some growth rate, it's a very simplistic way and so on, but there's this sort of 10x a year process, and that will eventually kind of like, you're going to transition the sort of whole economy from, as it broadens, from the sort of 2% a year to the sort of much faster growing process. And I don't know, I think that's very like consistent with historical change, stories of, right? There's this sort of like, there's this sort of long run hyperbolic trend, it manifested in the sort of change and growth mode in the Industrial Revolution, but there's just this long run hyperbolic trend. And, now you have that another sort of change in growth mode.
Yeah. That was one of the questions I asked Tyler when I had him on the podcast, is that you do go from the fact that after 1776, you go from a regime of negligible economic growth, 2%, is really interesting. It shows that, from the perspective of somebody in the Middle Ages or before, 2% is the equivalent to the sort of 10%.
Yeah.
I guess you're projecting even higher for the AI economy, but
it depends. I think, again, and it's all of this stuff, I have a lot of uncertainty, right? So a lot of the time I'm trying to kind of tell the modal story, because I think it's important to be kind of concrete and visceral about it. And I have a lot of uncertainty basically over how the 2030s play out. And basically the thing I know is it's going to be fucking crazy. But exactly what, where the bottlenecks are and so on, I think that'll be kind of like.
So let's talk through the numbers here. You hundreds of millions of AI researchers. So right now, GPT-4o Turbo is like $15 for 1 million tokens outputted, and a human thinks 150 tokens a minute or something. And if you do the math on that, I think it's for an hour's worth of human output. It's like 10 cents or something. Now,
cheaper than a human worker. Cheaper than a human worker. But it can't do the job yet.
That's right. But by the time you're talking about models that are trained on the 10 gigawatt cluster, then you have something that is 4 orders of magnitude more expensive via inference, 3 orders of magnitude, something like that. So that's like $100 an hour of labor. And now you're having hundreds of millions of such laborers. Is there enough compute to do with the model that is 1,000 times bigger this kind of labor?
Great. Okay, great question. So I actually don't think inference costs for sort of frontier models are necessarily going to go up that much. So I mean, one historical data point is—
But isn't the test time sort of thing that it will go up even higher?
I mean, we're just doing per token, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm just saying, if suppose each model token was the same as sort of a human token thing at 100 tokens a minute. So it's like, yeah, it'll use more, but the sort of, if you just, the token calculations is already pricing that in. The question is like per token pricing, right? So like GPT-3 when it launched was like actually more expensive than GPT-4 now. And so over just like, fast increases in capability gains, inference costs has remained constant. That's sort of wild. I think it's worth appreciating. And I think it gestures at sort of an underlying pace of algorithmic progress. I think there's a sort of like more theoretically grounded way to why inference costs would stay constant. And it's the following story, right? So on chinchilla scaling laws, right? Half of the additional compute you allocate to bigger models and half of it you allocate to more data, right? But also, if we go with the sort of basic story of half an order of a year more compute and half an order of magnitude a year of algorithmic progress, you're also kind of like, you're saving half an order of magnitude a year. And so that kind of would exactly compensate for making the model bigger. The caveat on that is, obviously not all training efficiencies are also inference efficiencies. A bunch of the time they are. Separately, you can find inference efficiencies. So I don't know, given this historical trend, given the sort of like, baseline sort of theoretical reason, I don't know. I think it's not crazy baseline assumption that actually these models, the frontier models, are not necessarily going to get more expensive per token.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's wild.
We'll see. I mean, the other thing, maybe they get, even if they get like 10x more expensive, then you have 10 million instead of 100 million. So it's like it's not really, like.
Okay, so part of the intelligence explosion is that each of them has to run experiments. That are GPT-4 sized, and the result so that takes up a bunch of compute.
Yes.
Then you have to consolidate the results of the experiments and what is the synthesized.
I mean, you have a much bigger influence street anyway than you're training.
Sure. Okay.
But I think the experiment compute is a constraint.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah. Going back to maybe a sort of bigger fundamental thing we're talking about here. We're projecting. In a series, you say we should denominate the probability of getting to AGI in terms of orders of magnitude of effective compute. Effective here, accounting for the fact that there's a quote unquote compute multiplier if you have better algorithms.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that it makes sense to be confident that this is a sensible way to project progress. It might be, but I'm just like, I have a lot of uncertainty about it. It seems similar to somebody trying to project when we're going to get to the moon. And they're like looking at the Apollo program in the 50s or something. And they're like, we have some amount of effective jet fuel. And if we get more efficient engines, then we have more effective jet fuel. Okay. And so we're going to like probability of getting to the moon based on the amount of effective jet fuel we have. And I don't deny that jet fuel is important to launch rockets. But that seems like an odd way to denominate when you're going to get to the moon.
So I mean, I think these cases are pretty different. I don't know. I don't think there is a sort of clear. I don't know how rocket science works, but I didn't get the impression that there's some clear scaling behavior with like the amount of jet fuel. I think in AI, I mean, first of all, the scaling laws, they've just held. Right. And so a friend of mine pointed this out, and I think it's a great point. If you kind of concatenate both the sort of original Kaplan scaling laws paper that I think went from 10 to the -9 to 10 petaflop days, and then, concatenate additional compute from there to kind of GPT-4, you assume some algorithmic progress, it's like the scaling laws have held, like probably over 15 ohms, I know it's rough calculation, probably maybe even more. Held for a lot of ohms.
They've held for the specific loss function which they're trained on, which is training the next token. Whereas the progress you are forecasting will be required for further progress. In capabilities. It was specifically, we know that scaling can't work because of the data wall. And so there's some new thing that has to happen. And I'm not sure whether you can extrapolate that same scaling curve to tell us whether these hobblings will also like is this not on the same graph?
The hobblings are just a separate thing.
Exactly.
So this is sort of like, it's So I mean, a few things here, right? Okay, so on the effective compute scaling, in some sense, I think it's like people center the scaling laws because they're easy to explain and the sort of like why does scaling matter? The scaling laws like came way after people, or at least like Dario, Ilya realized that scaling mattered. And I think that almost more important than the sort of loss curve is just in general, you make there's this great quote from Dario on your podcast. It's just like Ilya was like the models, they just want to learn. You make them bigger, they learn more, and that just applied just across domains generally. All the capabilities, and so and you can look at this in benchmarks again, like you say, headwind, data wall, and I'm sort of bracketing that and talking about that separately. The other thing is unhobblings, right? If you just put them on the effective compute graph, these unhobblings would be kind of huge, right? So like I think.
But what does that even mean? Like what is on the y-axis here?
Like say MLPR on this benchmark or whatever, right? And so, we mentioned the sort of, the LM-sys differences, RLHF, again, as good as 100x more chain of thought, right? Chain of just going from this prompting change, a simple algorithmic change can be like 10x effective compute increases on like math benchmarks. I think this is I think this is useful to illustrate that unhobblings are large, but I think they're I kind of think of them as like slightly separate things. And kind of the way I think about it is that like at a per token level, I think GP4 is not that far away from like a token of my internal monologue, right? Even like 3.5 to 4 took us kind of from like the bottom of the human range to the top of the human range on like a lot of, kind of like high school tests. And so it's like a few more 3.5 to 4 jumps per token basis, like per token intelligence. And then you've got to unlock the test time. You've got to solve the onboarding problem, make it use a computer. And then you're getting real close.
I'm reminded of,
and again, the story might be wrong, but I think it is strikingly plausible.
I agree. And so
I think actually, the other thing I'll say is like, I say this 2027 timeline, I think it's unlikely, but I do think there's worlds that are like AGI next year. And that's basically if the test time compute overhang is really easy to crack. If it's really easy to crack, then you do like 4 rooms of test time compute, from a few hundred tokens to a few million tokens, quickly. And then, again, maybe it only takes 1 or 2, 3.5 to 4 jumps per token. Like 1 or 2 of those jumps per token, plus uses test time compute, and you basically have the proto-automated engineer.
So I'm reminded of Steven Pinker releases this book on what is it? The Better Angels of Our Nature, and it's like a couple of years ago or something. And he says the secular decline in violence and war and everything, and you can just like plot the line from the end of World War II. And in fact, before World War II, then these are just aberrations, whatever. And basically, as soon as it happens, Ukraine, Gaza, everything is like. So
and basically ASI and crazy global conflict,
right.
ASI and crazy new WMDs.
I think this is a sort of thing that happens in history where you see a straight line and you're like, oh my gosh, and then just like as soon as you make that prediction, who was that famous author?
But again, people are predicting deep learning will hit a wall every year. Maybe one year they're right, but it's like gone a long way and it hasn't hit a wall. And we don't have that much more to go. And so yeah.
Okay, so I think this is a sort of plausible story, and let's just run with it and see what it implies.
Yeah.
So we were in your series, you talk about alignment from the perspective of this is not about some doomer scheme to get the 0.01% probability distribution where things don't go off the rails. It's more about just controlling the systems, making sure they do what we intend them to do. If that's the case, and we're going to be in this sort of geopolitical conflict with China, and part of that will involve, and what we're worried about is them making these CCP bots that go out and take the red flag of Mao across the galaxies or something, then shouldn't we be worried about alignment as something that, if you're in the wrong hands, this is the thing that enables brainwashing, sort of dictatorial control? This seems like a worrying thing. This should be part of the sort of algorithmic secrets we keep hidden, right? How to align these models, because that's also something the CCP can use to control their models.
I think in the world where you get the democratic coalition, also just alignment is often dual use, right? Like RLHF, it's like alignment team developed it was great, it was a big win for alignment, but it's also obviously makes these models useful,
right?
Alignment enables the CCP bots. Alignment also is what you need to get the sort of whatever USAI, so like follow the Constitution and like disobey unlawful orders, and like respect separation of powers and checks and balances, and you need alignment for whatever you want to do. It's just it's the sort of underlying technique.
Tell me what you make of this take. I've been struggling with this a little bit.
Okay,
so fundamentally, there's many different ways the future could go. there's one path in which the Eliezer type crazy AIs with the nanobots take the future and to turn everything into gray goo or paper clips. And the more you solve alignment, the more that path of the decision tree is circumscribed. And then, so the more you solve alignment, the more it is just different humans and the visions they have. And of course, we know from history that things don't turn out the way you expect. So it's not like you can decide the future, but it will appear.
Part of the beauty of it, right?
Yeah,
you want these mechanisms of error correction, pluralism.
But from the perspective of anybody who's looking at the system, it will be like, I can control where this thing is going to end up. And so the more you solve alignment and the more you circumscribe the different futures that are the result of AI the more that accentuates the conflict between humans and their visions of the future. And so in the world where alignment is solved, and the world in which alignment is solved is the world in which you have the most sort of human conflict over where to take AI.
Yeah, I mean, it's, by removing the worlds in which the AIs take over, then like, the remaining worlds are the ones where it's like the humans decide what happens. And then as we talked about, there's a whole lot of, worlds and how that could go. And
I worry, so when you think about alignment and it's just controlling these things, just think a little forward, and there's worlds in which hopefully, human descendants or some version of things in the future merge with super intelligences and they have the rules of their own, but they're in some sort of law and market-based order. I worry about if you have things that are conscious and should be treated with rights. If you read about what alignment schemes actually are, and then you read these books about what actually happened during the Cultural Revolution, what happened when Stalin took over Russia, and you have very strong monitoring from different instances where everybody's tasked with watching each other. You have brainwashing, you have red teaming, where you have the spy stuff you were talking about, where you try to convince somebody you're on like a defector and you see if they defect with you. And if they do, then you realize they're an enemy and then you and listen, maybe I'm stretching the analogy too far. But the way, like, the ease with which these alignment techniques actually map on to something you could have read about during like Mao's Cultural Revolution is a little bit troubling.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think sentient AI is a whole other topic. I don't know if we want to talk about it. I agree that like it's going to be very important how we treat them. In terms of like what you're actually programming these systems to do. Again, it's like alignment is just, it's a technical problem, a technical solution. It enables the CCP bots. I mean, in some sense, I think the, I almost feel like the sort of model, and also about talking about checks and balances, is sort of, like the Federal Reserve or Supreme Court justices. And there's a funny way in which they're kind of this like very dedicated order, like, Supreme Court justices. And it's amazing. They're actually quite high quality, right? And they like really smart people. They really believe in the Constitution. They love the Constitution. They believe in the principles. They have, these wonderful, and they have different persuasions, but they have sort of, I think, very sincere kind of debates about what is the meaning of the Constitution? What is the best actuation of these principles? I guess, by the way, recommendation, sort of SCOTUS Oral Arguments is like the best podcast, when I run out of high quality content on the internet. I mean, I think there's going to be a process of like figuring out what the Constitution should be. I think, this Constitution has like worked for a long time. You start with that. Maybe eventually things change enough that you want edits to that. But anyway, you want them to like, for example, for the checks and balances, they really love the Constitution and they believe in it and they take it really seriously. And like, look, at some point, you are going to have like AI police and AI military. But I think sort of like, being able to ensure that they like, believe in it in the way that like a Supreme Court justice does, or like in the way that like a Federal Reserve official takes their job really seriously.
And I guess the big open question is whether if you do the project or something like the project.
And sorry, the other important thing is like a bunch of different factions need their own AIs, right? And so it's really important that like each political party gets to like have their, and like whatever crazy, you might totally disagree with their values, but it's like, it's really important that they get to like have their own kind of like super intelligence. And again, I think it's that these sort of like classical liberal processes play out, including like different people of different persuasions and so on. And I don't know, maybe the AI advisors might not make them, wise. They might not follow the advice or whatever, but I think it's important.
Okay, so speaking of alignment, you seem pretty optimistic. So let's run through the source of the optimism. I think you laid out different worlds in which we could get AI. There's one that you think is low probability of next year, where GPT-4 plus scaffolding plus unhouplings gets you to AGI.
Not GPT-4, like...
Oh, sorry. So GPT-5,
yeah.
And there's ones where it takes much longer. There's ones where it's something that's a couple of years.
In a modal world,
So GPT-4 seems pretty aligned in the sense that I don't expect it to go off the rails.
Yeah.
Maybe with scaffolding, things might change.
Looks pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, maybe you will keep there's cranks, you keep going up, and one of the cranks gets you to ASI.
Yeah.
Is there any point at which the sharp left turn happens? Is it when you start, is it the case that you think plausibly when they act more like agents, this is a thing to worry about?
Yeah.
Is there anything qualitatively that you expect to change with regards to the alignment perspective? These cranks.
So I don't know if I believe in this concept of sharp left turn, but I do think there's important qualitative changes that happen between now and kind of like somewhat superhuman systems, kind of like early on in the intelligence explosion. And then important qualitative changes that happen from like early in intelligence explosion to kind of like true super intelligence and all its power and might. And let's talk about both of those. And so, so the first part of the problem is one, we're going to have to solve ourselves, right? We're going to have to line the like initial AIs and the intelligence explosion, the sort of automated Alec Bradford. I think there's kind of like, two important things that change from GPT-4, right? So one of them is, if you believe the story on like, synthetic data or self-play to get past the data wall, and if you believe this on Hobbling story, at the end, you're going to have things, they're agents, right? Including they do long-term plans, right? They have they're able to act over long horizons, right? But you need that, right? That's a sort of prerequisite to be able to do the sort of automated AI research. And so, I think there's basically, I basically think sort of pre-training is sort of alignment neutral in the sense of like, it has all these representations. It has good representations that, as representations of doing bad things, but it's not like, scheming against you or whatever. I think the sort of misalignment can arise once you're doing more kind of long horizon training, right? And so you're training, again, too simplified example, but to kind of illustrate, you're training an AI to make money. And, if you're just doing that with reinforcement learning, it might learn to commit fraud or lie or deceive or seek power simply because those are successful strategies in the real world, right? So maybe, RL is basically, it explores, maybe it figures out like, oh, it tries to like hack and then it gets some money and that made more money, and then if that's successful, if that gets reward, that's just reinforced. So basically, I think there's sort of more serious misalignments, kind of like misaligned long-term goals that could arise between now or that sort of necessarily have to be able to arise if you're able to get long horizon system. That's one. What you want to do in that situation is you want to add side constraints, right? So you want to add, don't lie, don't deceive, don't commit fraud. And so how do you add those side constraints, right? The sort of basic idea you might have is like RLHF, right? You're kind of like, it has this goal of like, make money or whatever, but you're watching what it's doing. If it starts trying to like, lie or deceive or fraud or whatever, or break the law, you're just kind of like thumbs down, don't do that. You anti-reinforce that. The sort of critical issue that comes in is that these AI systems are getting superhuman, right? And they're going to be able to do things that are too complex for humans to evaluate, right? So again, even early on, in the intelligence explosion, the automated AI researchers and engineers, they might write millions, billions, trillions of lines of complicated code. They might be doing all sorts of stuff you just like don't understand anymore. And so, in the million lines of code, is it somewhere kind of like, hacking or like exfiltrating itself or like, trying to go for the nukes or whatever, you don't know anymore. Right. And so this sort of like, thumbs up, thumbs down, pure RLHF doesn't fully work anymore. Second part of the picture, and we should maybe talk more about this. First part of the picture, I think it's going to be like, there's a hard technical problem of what do you do sort of post RLHF, but I think it's a solvable problem. And it's like, there's various things I'm bullish on. I think there's like ways in which deep learning has shaped out favorably. The second part of the problem is you're going from your like initial systems of the intelligence explosion to like super intelligence. And, it's like many ooms. It ends up being like, by the end of it, you have a thing that's vastly smarter than humans. I think the intelligence explosion is really scary from an alignment point of view, because basically if you have this rapid intelligence explosion, less than a year, 2 years or whatever, you're going, say in the period of a year, from systems where like, failure would be bad, but it's not catastrophic, to like, saying a bad word. It's like, something goes awry, to like, failure is like, it exfiltrated itself. It starts hacking the military. It can do really bad things. You're going less than a year from sort of a world in which like, it's some descendant of current systems and you kind of understand it. And it's like, has good properties. There's something that potentially has a very sort of alien and different architecture, right? After having gone through another decade of ML advances. I think one example there that's very salient to me is legible and faithful chain of thought, right? So a lot of the time when we're talking about these things, we're talking about, it has tokens of thinking and then it uses many tokens of thinking. And, maybe we bootstrap ourselves by, it's pre-trained, it learns to think in English, then we do something else on top. So it can do the sort of longer chains of thought. And so, it's very plausible to me that like for the initial automated alignment researchers, we don't need to do any complicated mechanistic interpretability. You can just like literally read what they're thinking. which is great. You know, it's like huge advantage, right? However, it's very likely not the most efficient way to do it, right? There's like probably some way to have a recurrent architecture. It's all internal states. There's a much more efficient way to do it. That's what you get by the end of the year. You know, you're going this year from like RLHF++, some extension works to like, it's vastly superhuman. It's like, you know, it's to us like, you know, an expert in the field might be to like an elementary school or middle schooler. And so, you know, I think it's this sort of incredibly sort of like hairy period for alignment. Thing you do have is you have the automated AI researchers, right? And so you can use the automated AI researchers to also do alignment.
And so in this world, why are we optimistic that the project is being run by people who are thinking? I think so. Here's something to think about.
Okay.
The OpenAI starts off with people who are very explicitly thinking about exactly these kinds of things.
Yes.
Right?
But are they still there?
No, but so here's the thing. No, even the people who are there, even like the current leadership is like exactly these things. You can find them in interviews in their blog posts talking about. And what happens is when, as you were talking about, when some sort of trivial, and Jan talked about it, this is not just you, Jan talked about it in his tweet thread, when there is some trade-off that has to be made with, we need to do this flashy release this week and not next week because whatever Google I/O is the next week, so we need to get it. And then the trade-off is made in favor of the more careless decision. When we have the government or the national security advisor, the military or whatever, which is much less familiar with this kind of discourse, is naturally thinking in this way about, I'm worried the chain of thought isn't faithful, and how do we think about the features that are represented here? Why should we be optimistic that a project run by people like that will be thoughtful about these kinds of considerations?
I mean, they might not be. You know, I agree. I think, okay, a few thoughts, right? First of all, I think the private world, even if they sort of nominally care, is extremely tough for alignment. A couple of reasons. One, you just have the race between the sort of commercial labs, right? And it's like, you don't have any headroom there to like be like, actually, we're going to hold back for 3 months, like get this right. And, you know, we're going to dedicate 90% of our compute to automated alignment research instead of just like pushing the next doom. The other thing, though, is like in the private world, you know, China has stolen your weights. China has your secrets. They're right on your tails. You're in this fever struggle. No room at all for maneuver. The way it's like absolutely essential to get alignment right and to get it during this intelligence explosion to get it right is you need to have that room to maneuver and you need to have that clear lead. You know, again, maybe you've made the deal or whatever, but I think you're in an incredibly tough spot if you don't have this clear lead. So I think the sort of private world is kind of rough there. On like whether people will take it seriously, you know, I don't know. I have some faith in sort of normal mechanisms of a liberal society. That sort of if alignment is an issue, which, you know, we don't fully know yet, but sort of the science will develop. We're going to get better measurements of alignment, you know, and the case will be clear and obvious. I worry that I worry about worlds where evidence is ambiguous, and I think a lot of the most scary kind of intelligence explosion scenarios are worlds in which evidence is ambiguous. But again, it's sort of like, if evidence is ambiguous, then that's the worlds in which you really want the safety margins. And that's also the worlds in which kind of like running the intelligence explosion is sort of like, you know, running a war, right? It's like, the evidence is ambiguous. We have to make these really tough trade-offs. And you better have a really good chain of command for that. And it's not just like, you know, YOLOing it, let's go, you know, it's cool.
Let's talk a little bit about Germany. We're making the analogy to World War II, and you made a really interesting point many hours ago at this point about
we should sauna after, you know, after the marathon.
The fact that throughout history, World War II is not unique, at least when you think in proportion to the size of the population. But these other sorts of catastrophes where some significant portion of the population has been killed off. After that, the nation recovers and they get back to their heights. And so what's interesting after World War II is that Germany especially, and maybe Europe as a whole, obviously they experienced fast economic growth in the direct aftermath because of catch-up growth. But subsequently, we just don't think of Germany as, no, we're not talking about Germany potentially launching an intelligence explosion and they're going to get in seat at the AI table. We were talking about Iran and North Korea and Russia. We didn't talk about Germany, right?
Well, because they're allies.
But But So what happened? I mean, the World War II, and now it didn't like come back out of the 7 Years' War or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm generally very bearish on Germany. I think in this context, I'm kind of like, it's a little bit, I think you're underrating a little bit. I think it's probably still one of the, top 5 most important countries in the world. I mean, Europe overall, it still has, I mean, it's a GDP that's like close to the United States, the size of the GDP, and there's things actually that Germany is kind of good at, right? Like state capacity, right? Like, the roads are good and they're clean and they're well maintained, and in some sense, the sort of a lot of this is the sort of flip side of things that I think are bad about Germany, right? So in the U.S., it's a little bit like there's a bit more of a sort of Wild West feeling to the United States, right? And it includes the kind of like crazy bursts of creativity. It includes like political candidates that are sort of there's a much broader spectrum, and like both an Obama and a Trump is somebody you just wouldn't see in the sort of much more confined kind of German political debate. I wrote this blog post at some point, Europe's Political Stupor, about this. But anyway, and so there's this sort of punctilious sort of rule following that is like good in terms of like, keeping your kind of state capacity functioning. But that is also, I think I think there's a sort of very constrained view of the world in some sense. And that includes kind of, I think after World War II, there's a real backlash against anything like elite, and, again, no elite high schools or elite colleges, and sort of
why is that the logic?
Excellence isn't cherished.
Why is that the logical intellectual thing to rebel against if you're trying to overcorrect from the Nazis? Was it because the Nazis were very much into elitism? I don't understand why that's a logical sort of counter reaction.
I don't know, maybe it was sort of a counter reaction against the sort of like whole like Aryan race and the sort of that sort of thing. I mean, I also just think there was a certain amount look at sort of World War I, end of World War I versus end of World War II for Germany, right? And sort of a common narrative is that the Peace of Versailles, was too strict on Germany. But the peace imposed after World War II was like much more strict, right? It was a complete, the whole country was destroyed. It was, and all the most of the major cities, over half of the housing stock had been destroyed, right? Like, in some birth cohorts, like 40% of the men had died.
Half the population displaced.
Oh yeah, I mean, almost 20 million people, right, displaced, right? Huge, crazy, right? Like,
and the borders are way smaller than the Versailles borders.
Yeah, exactly, and sort of complete imposition of a new political system, and on both sides, yeah, so it was, but in some sense that worked out better than the post-World War I piece, where then there was this kind of resurgence of German nationalism, and in some sense a thing that has been a pattern. So it's sort of like, it's unclear if you want to wake the sleeping beast. I do think that at this point, it's gotten a bit too sleepy.
Yeah. I do think it's an interesting point about we underrate the American political system, and I've been making the same correction myself.
Yeah.
There was this book written by a Chinese economist called China's Worldview. Yeah. And overall, I wasn't a big fan, but they made a really interesting point in there.
Yeah.
Which was the way in which candidates rise up through the Chinese hierarchy for politics, for administration. In some sense, it selects for, you're not going to get some Marjorie Taylor Greene or somebody running.
Don't get that in Germany either.
Right.
Yeah.
But he explicitly made the point in the book that also means we're never going to get a Henry Kissinger or Barack Obama in China. We're going to get like, by the time they end up in charge of the Politburo, on the Politburo, there'll be like some 60-year-old bureaucrat who's never like ruffled any feathers.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something really important about the sort of like very raucous political debate, and I mean, in general, kind of like, there's the sense in which in America, lots of people live in their kind of like own world. I mean, like we live in this kind of bizarre little like bubble in San Francisco, and people, but I think that's important for the sort of evolution of ideas, error correction, that sort of thing. There's other ways in which the German system is more functional.
But it is interesting that
it leads to major mistakes, right? Like the sort of defense spending, right? And then Russia invades Ukraine, and you're like, wow, what did we do?
Right. No, that's a really good point, right? The main issues, everybody agrees,
like no debate about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's sort of consensus blob kind of thing.
Right.
And on the China point, just having this experience of like reading German newspapers, and I think how much more poorly I would understand the sort of German debate and sort of the sort of state of mind from just kind of afar. I worry a lot about, or I think it is interesting just how kind of impenetrable China is to me. It's like it's a billion people, right? And like, you know, almost everything else is really globalized. You have a globalized internet, and I kind of have a sense of what's happening in the UK. You know, I probably, even if I didn't read German newspapers, I sort of would have a sense of what's happening in Germany, but I really don't feel like I have a sense of what, like, you know, what is the state of mind, what is the state of political debate, you know, of a sort of average Chinese person or like an average Chinese elite. And I think that I find that distance kind of worrying. And you know, and there's some people who do this and they do really great work where they kind of go through the like party documents and the party speeches. And it seems to require kind of a lot of interpretive ability where there's like very specific words in Mandarin that like will have one connotation, not the other connotation. But yeah, I think it's sort of interesting given how globalized everything is. And like, I mean, now we have basically perfect translation machines, and it's still so impenetrable.
That's really interesting. I'm sort of ashamed almost that I haven't done this yet. I think many months ago, when Alexei interviewed me on his YouTube channel, I said, I'm meaning to go to China to actually see for myself what's going on. And actually, I should. So, by the way, if anybody listening has a lot of context on China, if I went to China who could introduce me to people, please email me.
Because you got to do some pods, and you got to find some of the Chinese AI researchers, man.
I know
that'd be so good.
I was thinking at some point. Again, this is
the fact that I freely, but you know, I don't know if they can speak freely. But
I was thinking of so they had these papers, and on the paper they'll say who's a co-author. It's funny because. Well, I was thinking of just cold emailing everybody. Like, here's my Calendly. Can you let's just talk. I just want to see what is the vibe. Even if they don't tell me anything, I'm just like, what kind of person is this? Are they how westernized are they? But as I was saying this, I just remembered that in fact, ByteDance, according to mutual friends we have at Google, they cold emailed every single person on the Gemini paper and said, if you come work for ByteDance, we'll make you an LED engineer. You'll report directly to the CTO and. In fact, this actually, I'm going to go...
that's how the secrets go over, right?
Right. No, I'm actually very curious. I meant to ask this earlier, but suppose they hired if there's only 100 or so people, or maybe less, who are working on the key algorithmic secrets. If they hired one such person, is all the alpha gone that these labs have?
If this person was intentional about it, they could get a lot. I mean, they couldn't get the sort of like... I mean, actually, they could probably just also exfiltrate the code. They could get a lot of the key ideas. Again, like, you know, up until recently, stuff was published, but, you know... They could get a lot of the key ideas if they tried, if they like, you know, I think there's a lot of people who don't actually kind of like look around to see what the other teams are doing, but you know, I think you kind of can. But yeah, I mean, they could, it's scary.
Right. I think the project makes more sense there where you can't just recruit a Manhattan project engineer and then just get
I mean, it's like these are secrets that can be used for like probably every training run in the future. That'll be like maybe are the key to the data wall that are like they can't go on or they can't go on that are like, you know, they're going to be worth, you know, given sort of like the multipliers on compute, you know, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, you know, and all it takes is, you know, China to offer $100 million to somebody and be like, come work for us. And then I mean, I'm really uncertain on how sort of seriously China is taking AGI right now. One anecdote that was related to me on the topic of anecdotes, by another sort of like you know, kind of researcher in the field, was at some point they were at a conference with somebody, a Chinese AI researcher, and he was talking to him and he was like, I think it's really good that you're here, and like, you know, we got to have the international coordination and stuff. And apparently this guy said that I'm the kind of senior-most person that they're going to let leave the country to come to things like this.
Wait, what's the takeaway?
As in, they're not letting really senior AI researchers leave the country.
Interesting.
Kind of classic, you know, Eastern Bloc move.
I
don't know if this is true, but it's what I heard.
That's interesting. So I thought the point you made earlier about being exposed to German newspapers and also because earlier you were interested in economics and law and national security, you have the variety and intellectual diet there has exposed you to thinking about the geopolitical question here in ways others talking about AI. I mean, this is the first episode I've done about this where we've talked about things like this, which is, now that I think about it, weird given that this is an obvious thing in retrospect. I should have been thinking about. Anyways, so that's one thing we've been missing. What are you missing? And national security you're thinking about, so you can't say national security. What like key perspective are you probably underexposed to as a result? And China, I guess you mentioned.
Yeah, so I think the China one is an important one. I mean, I think another one would be a sort of very Tyler Cowen-esque take, which is like, you're not exposed to how will a normal person in America,
right,
like, both like use AI, probably not, know, and that being kind of like bottlenecks to the fusion of these things. And, I'm overrating the revenue because I'm kind of like, everyone at staff is adopting it, but, kind of like, Joe Schmo engineer at a company, like, will they be able to integrate it? And then also the reaction to it, right? I mean, I think this was a question again, hours ago, where it was, about like, won't people kind of rebel against this?
Yeah.
And they won't want to do the project. I don't know, maybe they will. Yeah.
Here's a political reaction that I didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
So Tucker Carlson was recently on the Joe Rogan episode. I already told you about this, but I'm just going to tell the story again.
You should.
So Tucker Carlson is on Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
And they start talking about World War II. And Tucker says, well, listen, I'm going to say something that my fellow conservatives won't like, but I think nuclear weapons are immoral. I think it was obviously immoral that we used them on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And then he says, in fact, nuclear weapons are always immoral. Except when we would use them on data centers. In fact, it would be immoral not to use them on data centers because look, these people in Silicon Valley, these fucking nerds are making AGI super intelligence, and they say that it could enslave humanity. We made machines to serve humanity, not to enslave humanity, and they're just going on and making these machines. And so we should, of course, be nuking the data centers. And that is
real
definitely
horseshoe.
And that is definitely not a political reaction in 2024. I was expecting.
Who knows, man?
Yeah.
It's gonna
be crazy.
It's gonna be crazy.
The thing we learned with COVID is that also the left-right reactions that you would anticipate just based on hunches.
It completely flipped multiple times, right? Initially, like kind of the right was like,
it's like so contingent,
and then the left was like, this is racist, and then it flipped. The left was really into the code, and the whole thing also is just like so blunt and crude, and so I don't know. I think probably in general, I think people are really people like to make sort of complicated technocratic AI policy proposals, and I think especially if things go kind of fairly rapidly on the path to AGI. There might not actually be that much space for kind of like complicated, kind of like, clever proposals. It might just be kind of much cruder reactions.
Yeah. Look, and then also when you mention the spies and national security getting involved and everything, and you can talk about that in the abstract, but now that we're living in San Francisco and we know many of the people who are doing the top AI research, it's also a little scary to think about people I personally know and friends with. It's not unfeasible if they have secrets in their head that are worth $100 billion or something. Kidnapping, assassination, sabotage.
Oh, their family, or it's really bad. I mean, I guess it's to the point on security. Like right now, it's just really foreign. But at some point, as it becomes like really serious, it's you're gonna want the security cards.
Yeah. So presumably, you have thought about the fact that people in China will be listening to this and will be reading your series. And somehow you made the trade-off that it's better to let the whole world know, and also including China, and wake them up to AGI, which is part of the thing you're worried about, is China waking up to AGI, than to stay silent. I'm just curious, walk me through how you've thought about that trade-off.
I actually, I think this is a tough trade-off. I thought about this a bunch. I think, I think people in the PRC will read this. I think there's some extent to which sort of the cat is out of the bag. This is like not, AGI being a thing people are thinking about very seriously is not new anymore. There's sort of, a lot of these takes are kind of old, or, I had similar views a year ago. I might not have written it up a year ago, in part because I think this cat wasn't out of the bag enough. I think the other thing is, I think to be able to manage this challenge, I think much broader swaths of society will need to wake up. Right. And if we're going to get the project, we actually need sort of like, a broad bipartisan understanding of the challenges facing us. And so, I think it's a tough trade-off, but I think the sort of need to wake up people in the United States, in the sort of Western world, in the Democratic coalition, is ultimately imperative. And, I think my hope is more people here will read it than in the PRC. And I think people sometimes underrate the importance of just kind of like writing it up, laying out the strategic picture. I think you've done actually a great service to sort of mankind in some sense by, with your podcast. I think it's overall been good.
Okay, so
by the way, on the topic of Germany, we were talking at some point about kind of immigration stories.
Right.
I feel like you have a kind of interesting story you haven't told, and I think you should tell.
So a couple of years ago, I was in college and I was 20.
Yeah,
I was about to turn 21.
Yeah,
I think it was.
So you came from India when you were really young.
Right. Yeah. So until I was 8 or 9, I lived in India, and then we moved around all over the place. But because of the backlog for Indians,
the green card backlog.
It's we've been in the queue for like decades.
Even though you came at 8, you're still on the H-1B.
And when you're 21, you get kicked off the queue, and you had to restart the process. So I'm on my dad's a doctor, and I'm on his H-1B as a dependent. But when you're 21, you get kicked off. And so I'm 20, and it just like kind of dawns on me that this is my situation.
And you're completely screwed.
Right. And so I also had the experience that my dad, we've like moved all around the country. They have to prove that him as a doctor is like, you can't get native talent.
So and where can a startup? You just like
so where can you not get native?
And like even getting the H-1B for you would have been like 20% lottery. So it's like, if you're lucky, you're in this.
And they had to prove that they can't get native talent, which means like for him, I'm like we lived in North Dakota for 3 years, West Virginia for 3 years, Maryland, West Texas. And so it kind of dawned on me, this is my situation. As I turn 21, I'll be like on this lottery. Even if I get the lottery, I'll be a fucking code monkey for the rest of my life, because this thing isn't going to let up.
Can't do a startup.
Exactly. And so at the same time, I had been reading for the last year. I've been super obsessed with Paul Graham essays. My plan at the time was to make a startup or something. I was super excited about that. And it just occurred to me that I couldn't do this. That like this is just not in the cards for me. And so I was kind of depressed about it. I remember I kind of just, I was in a daze through finals because it had just occurred to me, and I was really like anxious about it. And I remember thinking to myself at the time that if somehow I end up getting my green card before I turn 21, there's no fucking way I'm becoming a code monkey. Because the thing that like this feeling of dread that I have is this realization that I'm just gonna have to be a code monkey. And I realized that's my default path. If I hadn't sort of made a proactive effort not to do that, I would have graduated college as a computer science student, and I would have just done that. And that's the thing I was super scared about. So that was an important sort of realization for me. Anyway, so COVID happened, and because of that, since there weren't foreigners coming, the backlog cleared fast. And by the skin of my teeth, like a few months before I turned 21.
So crazy.
Extremely contingent reasons. I ended up getting a and because I got a green card, I could,
and the whole podcast, right?
Exactly, it's I graduated college, and I was like bumming around, and I graduated a semester early. I'm gonna like do this podcast, see what happens. And it was, if I didn't have a green card,
it's such a best case scenario, artifact, and it only existed because it's actually, because I think it's hard. What is the impact of like immigration reform? Like, what is the impact of clearing, like whatever, 50,000 green cards in the backlog? And you're such like an amazing example of like, all of this is only possible. And it's just incredibly tragic that this is so dysfunctional.
No, it's insane.
I'm glad you did it. I'm glad you kind of like, tried the unusual path.
Well, but I could only do it. Obviously, I was extremely fortunate that I got the green card. I was like, I had a little bit of saved up money, and I got a small grant out of college, thanks to the Future Fund, to like do this for basically the equivalent of 6 months. And so it turned out really well. And then at each time when I was like, okay, podcast, come on. I wasted a few months on this. Let's now go do something real. Something big would happen. I would, Jeff Bezos would,
You kept with it.
But so there would always be, just like the moment I'm about to quit the podcast, something like Jeff Bezos would say that there's something nice about me on Twitter. The Ilya episodes gets like 500,000 views,
nice.
So, and then now this is my career, but it was a sort of very, looking back on it, incredibly contingent that things worked out the right way.
I mean, look, if the AGI stuff goes down, it'll be the most important kind of like, source of, it'll be how maybe most of the people who kind of end up feeling the AGI first heard about it.
Also very much, you're very linked with the story in many ways. First, I got like a $20,000 grant from a Future Fund right out of college, and that sustained me for 6 months or however long it was.
Yeah.
And without that, I wouldn't.
Grand. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, 10 grand, or what was it?
No, it's tiny, but you know, it goes to show kind of how far small grants can go.
Yeah.
It's sort of the emergent ventures too. Yeah.
Exactly. The emergent ventures. Yeah. And the the last year I've been in San Francisco, we've just been in close contact the entire time and just bouncing ideas back and forth. I've learned just basically the alpha I have. I think people would be surprised by how much I got from you, Sholto, Trent, and a couple others. Just
I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. It's been super fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so some random questions for you.
Yeah.
If you could convert to Mormonism,
and
you could really believe it, would you do it? Would you push the button?
Well, okay. Before I answer that question, one sort of observation about the Mormons. So actually, there's an article that actually made a big impact on me. I think it was by McKay Coppins at some point, in the Atlantic or whatever, about the Mormons. And I think the thing he kind of, and I think he even interviewed Mitt Romney in it and so on. And I think the thing I thought was really interesting in this article was he kind of talked about how the experience of kind of growing up different, growing up very unusual, especially if you grow up Mormon outside of Utah, the only person who doesn't drink caffeine, you don't drink alcohol, you're kind of weird. How that kind of got people prepared for being willing to be kind of outside of the norm later on. And Mitt Romney, was willing to kind of take stands alone, in his party because he believed, what he believed was true. And I don't know, I mean, probably not to the same way, but I feel a little bit like this from kind of having grown up in Germany and having, and really not having this sort of German system and having been kind of an outsider or something. I think there's a certain amount in which kind of, growing up an outsider gives you kind of unusual strength later on to be kind of willing to say what you think. And anyway, so that is one thing I really appreciate about the Mormons, at least the ones that grow up outside of Utah. The other thing, the fertility rates, they're good, they're important. So they're going down as well, right?
Right.
This is the thing that really clinched the kind of fertility decline story for me.
Even the Mormons.
Even the Mormons, right?
You're this is a sort of a good story. The Mormons will replace everybody.
Well, no, I don't know if it's good, but it's at least come on, at least some people will maintain high, but it's no, even the Mormons, and it's sort of basically once the sort of these religious subgroups have high fertility rates, once they kind of grow big enough, they become they're too close in contact with sort of normal society and become normalized. Mormon fertility rates drop from, I don't remember the exact numbers, maybe 4 to 2 in the course of 10, 20 years. Anyway, so it's now people point to the Amish or whatever, but I'm just it's probably just not scalable. And if you grow big enough, then there's just this sort of the sort of overwhelming force of modernity kind of gets you. No, if I could convert to Mormonism, look, I think there's something. I don't believe it, right? If I believed it, I obviously would convert to Mormonism, right? Because it's you gotta convert.
But you can choose a world in which you do believe it.
I think there's something really valuable in kind of believing in something greater than yourself and believing and having a certain amount of faith.
You do, right? That's what a series is.
And there's a feeling some sort of duty to the thing greater than yourself. And maybe my version of this is somewhat different. I think I feel some sort of duty to I feel like there's some sort of historical weight on how this might play out, and I feel some sort of duty to make that go well. I feel some sort of duty to our country, to the national security of the United States, and I think it can be a force for a lot of good.
Going back to the opening, I think just to, the thing that's especially impressive about that is, look, there's people who at the company who have, through years and decades of building up savings from working in tech, have probably tens of millions liquid, more than that in terms of their equity. And very many people were concerned about the clusters in the Middle East and the secrets leaking to China and all these things. But the person who actually made a hassle about it, and I think hassling people is so underrated. I think that one person who made a hassle about it is the 22-year-old who has less than a year of the company, who doesn't have savings built up, who isn't a solidified member of the I think that's a sort of
maybe it's me being naive and not knowing how big companies work, and but I think sometimes I'm a bit of a speech deontologist. I kind of believe in saying what you think. Sometimes friends tell me I should be more of a speech consequentialist.
No, I think I really think the amount of people who, when they have the opportunity to talk to the person, will just bring up the thing. I've been with you in multiple contexts, and I guess I shouldn't reveal who the person is or what the context was, but I've just been like very impressed that the dinner begins, and by the end, somebody who has a major voice in how things go is seriously thinking about a worldview they would have found incredibly alien before the dinner or something. And I've been impressed with it, just give them the spiel and hassle them.
I mean, look, I think I feel this stuff pretty viscerally now. You know, I think there's a time when I thought about this stuff a lot, but it was kind of like econ models and like, you know, kind of like these sort of theoretical abstractions. And, you know, you talk about human brain size or whatever.
Right.
And I think, you know, since at least last year, you know, I feel like I can see it, you know, and I feel it. And I think I can I can sort of see the cluster that AGI is going to be trained on, and I can see the kind of rough combination of algorithms and the people that be involved and how this is going to play out. And, you know, I think, look, we'll see how it plays out. There's many ways this could be wrong. There's many ways it could go, but I think this could get very real.
Yeah. Should we talk about what you're up to next?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So you're starting an investment firm.
Yep.
Anchor Investments from Nat Friedman, Daniel Gross, Patrick Collison, John Collison. First of all, why is this the thing to do? Okay. You believe the AGI is coming in a few years. Yeah. Why the investment firm?
Good question. Fair question. Okay. So, I mean, a couple of things. One is just, you know, I think we talked about this earlier, but it's like the screen doesn't go blank, you know, when sort of AGI or superintelligence happens. I think people really underrate basically the sort of decade after, right? You have the intelligence explosion. That's maybe the most sort of wild period. But I think the decade after is also going to be wild. And, you know, this combination of human institutions, but superintelligence, you have crazy kind of geopolitical things going on. You have the sort of broadening of this explosive growth. And, basically, yeah, I think it's going to be a really important period. I think capital will really matter. You know, eventually, you know, like, you know, going to go to the stars, you know, going to go to the galaxies. So anyway, so part of the answer is just like, look, I think done right, there's a lot of money to be made. You know, I think if AGI were priced in tomorrow, you could maybe make 100x. Probably you can make even way more than that because of the sequencing. And you know, capital matters. I think the other reason is just you know, some amount of freedom and independence. And I think, I think there's some people who are very smart about this AI stuff and who are kind of like see it coming. But I think almost all of them, you know, are kind of, you know, constrained in various ways, right? They're in the labs, you know, they're in some other position where they can't really talk about this stuff. And, you know, in some sense, I've really admired sort of the thing you've done, which is I think it's really important that there's sort of voices of reason on this stuff publicly, or people who are in positions to kind of advise important actors and so on. And so I think there's basically the thing this investment firm will be kind of like, you know, a brain trust on AI. It's going to be all about situational awareness. We're going to have the best situational awareness in the business. You know, we're going to have way more situational business than any of the people who manage money in New York. Yeah. We're definitely going to, we're going to do great on investing, but it's the same sort of situational awareness that I think is going to be important for understanding what's happening, being a voice of reason publicly, and sort of being able to be in a position to advise. Yeah.
The book about Peter Thiel. Yeah. They had an interesting quote about his hedge fund. I think it got terrible returns. So this isn't the example. I mean, right. That's the sort of bear case, right? It's like too theoretical. And yeah. But they had an interesting quote that it's like basically a think tank inside of a hedge fund. Yeah. That's what we're trying to build. Right. Yeah. So presumably you've thought about the ways in which these kinds of things can blow. There's a lot of interesting business history books about people who got the thesis right, but timed it wrong. Where they buy that the internet's going to be a big deal. They sell at the wrong time and buy at the wrong time during the dot-com boom. And so they miss out on the gains, even though they're right about the. Anyways, what is the trick to preventing that kind of thing? Yeah, I mean, look, obviously you can't, not blowing up is sort of like, task number 1 and 2 or whatever. I mean, I think this investment firm, it is going to just be betting on AGI, betting on AGI and superintelligence before the decade is out, taking that seriously, making the bets you would make, if you took that seriously. So, I think if that's wrong, firm is not going to do that well. The thing you have to be resistant to is like, you have to be able to resist to get, one or a couple or a few kind of individual calls, right? It's like AI stagnates for a year because of the data wall, or like, you got the call wrong on like when revenue would go up. And so anyway, that's pretty critical. You have to get timing right. I do think in general that the sort of sequence of bets on the way to AGI is actually pretty critical. And I think a thing people underrate. So
All right. I mean, yeah. So like, where does the story start, right? So like, obviously the sort of only bet over the last year was NVIDIA. It's obvious now, very few people did it. This is sort of also, a classic debate I and a friend had with another colleague of ours, where this colleague was really into TSM, TSMC. And he was just kind of like, well, like these fabs are going to be so valuable. And also like NVIDIA, there's just a lot of idiosyncratic risk, right? It's like maybe somebody else makes better GPUs. And that was basically right, but sort of only NVIDIA had the AI beta, right? Because only NVIDIA was kind of like a large fraction AI. The next few doublings would just like meaningfully explode their revenue. Whereas TSMC was, a couple percent AI. So, even though there's going to be a few doublings of AI, not going to make that big of an impact. All right. So it's sort of like the only place to find the AI beta basically was NVIDIA for a while. Now it's broadening, right? So now TSM is like, 20% AI by like 27 or something is what they're saying. One more doubling, it'll be kind of like a large fraction of what they're doing. And there's a whole stack. There's like there's people making memory and CoWoS and power. Utility companies are starting to get excited about AI, and they're like, oh, it'll power production in the United States will grow, not 2.5%, but 5% over the next 5 years. And I'm like, no, it'll grow more. At some point, like a Google or something becomes interesting. And, people are excited about them with AI because it's like, oh, AI revenue will be, 10 billion or tens of billions. And I'm kind of like, I don't really care about them before then. I care about it, once you get the AI beta, right? And so at some point, Google will get, $100 billion of revenue from AI. Mm-hmm. Probably their stock will explode. They're going to become, $5 trillion, $10 trillion company. Anyway, so the timing there is very important. You have to get the timing right. You have to get the sequence right. At some point, actually, I think like, there's going to be a real tailwind to equities from real interest rates, right? So basically in these sort of explosive growth worlds, you would expect real interest rates to go up a lot, both on the sort of like, basically both sides of the equation, right? On the supply side or on the sort of demand for money side, because, people are going to be making these crazy investments, initially in clusters and then in the robo factories or whatever, right? And so they're going to be borrowing like crazy. They want all this capital, high ROI. And then on the sort of like consumer saving side, right, to like, to give up all this capital, sort of like Euler equation, standard sort of intertemporal transfer, trade-off of consumption.
So standard.
Yeah. Well, if you
very
expect,
standard.
Basil and some of our friends have a paper on this. If you expect, if consumers expect real growth rates to be higher, interest rates are going to be higher because they're less willing to give up consumption.
Right.
Consumption in the they're less willing to give up consumption today for consumption in the future. Anyway, so at some point, real interest rates will go up. If sort of eta is greater than 1, that actually means equities. Higher growth rate expectations mean equities go down because the sort of interest rate effect outweighs the growth rate effect. And so, at some point there's like the big bond short. You got to get that right. You got to get it right that, nationalization, you got, anyway. So there's this whole sequence of things. You got to get that right.
And the unknown unknowns.
Unknown unknowns. Yeah. And so you've got to be really, really careful about your like overall like risk positioning, right? Because, if you expect these kind of crazy events to play out, there's going to be crazy things you didn't foresee. You do also want to make the sort of kind of bets that are tailored to your scenarios in the sense of like, you want to find bets that are bets on the tails, right? I don't think anyone is expecting, interest rates to go above, 10%, like real interest rates. But, I think there's at least a serious chance of that, before the decade is out. And so, maybe there's some like cheap insurance you can buy on that, that pays off.
Very silly question. Yeah. In these worlds.
Yeah.
Are financial markets where you make these kinds of bets going to be respected and is my Fidelity account going to mean anything when we have the 50% economic growth? Like who's like, we got to respect his property rights. That's pretty deep into
it. The bond short, the sort of 50% economic growth, that's pretty deep into it. I mean, again, there's this whole sequence of things. But yeah, no, I think property rates will be respected. Again, in the sort of modal world, the project, yeah. At some point, there's going to be figuring out the property rights for the galaxies, and that'll be interesting. But,
that will be interesting. So there's an interesting question about going back to your strategy about, the 30s will really matter a lot about how the rest of the future goes.
Yeah.
And you want to be in a position of influence by that point because of capital. It's worth considering, as far as I know, but there's probably a whole bunch of literature on this. I'm just riffing, but the landed gentry before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, I'm not sure if they were able to leverage their position in a sort of Georgist or Piketty type sense in order to accrue the returns that were realized through the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And I don't know what happened. Maybe at some point they just weren't the landed gentry. But I'd be concerned that even if you make great investment calls, you'll be like the guy who owned a lot of land, farmland before the Industrial Revolution. And like the guy who's actually going to make a bunch of money is the one with the steam engine. Even if he doesn't make that much money, most of the benefits are sort of widely diffused and so forth.
I mean, I think the analog is like you sell your land, you put it all in sort of the, the people who are building the new industry. I think the sort of like real depreciating asset, for me is human capital, right? Look, I'm serious, right? It's like, there's something about like, I don't know, it was like valedictorian of Columbia, the thing that made you special is you're smart.
Right.
But actually like, that might not matter in like 4 years, because it's actually automatable.
Right.
And so anyway, a friend joked that the sort of investment firm is perfectly hedged for me. And it's like, either like AGI this decade, and your human capital is depreciated, but you've turned that into financial capital, or, like no AGI this decade, in which case maybe the firm doesn't do that well, but, you're still in your 20s and you're still smart.
Excellent. And what's your story for why AGI hasn't been priced in? The story, financial markets are supposed to be very efficient. It's very, very hard to get an edge. Here, naively, you just say, well, I've looked at these scaling curves and they imply that we're going to be buying much more compute and energy than the analysts realize. Shouldn't those analysts be broke by now? What's going on?
I mean, I used to be a true EMH guy. I was an economist, I think the thing I, changed my mind on is that I think there can be kind of groups of people, smart people, who are, say they're in San Francisco, who do just have alpha over the rest of society and kind of seeing the future. And so like COVID, right? Like I think there's just honestly kind of similar group of people who just saw that and called it completely correctly. And, they shorted the market. They did really well. A bunch of other sort of things like that. Why is AGI not priced in? It's sort of, why hasn't the government nationalized the labs yet, right? It's like, this, society hasn't priced it in yet, and sort of it hasn't completely diffused. And, again, it might be wrong, right? But I just think sort of, not that many people take these ideas seriously yet.
A couple of other sort of ideas that I was playing around with regards to, we didn't get a chance to talk about, but the systems competition. There's a very interesting, one of my favorite books about World War II is Victor Davis Hanson summary of everything. And he explains why the Allies made better decisions than the Axis.
Why did they?
And so obviously there were some decisions the Axis made that were pretty like Blitzkrieg, whatever.
That was sort of by accident though.
Well, in what sense? That they just had the infrastructure left over?
Well, no, I mean, I think sort of my read of it is Blitzkrieg wasn't kind of some like ingenious strategy. It was just kind of, it's like more like their hand was forced. This is sort of the very Adam Toozian story of World War II, right? But it was, there's sort of this long war versus short war. I think it's actually kind of an important concept. I think sort of Germany realized that if they were in a long war, including the United States, they would not be able to compete industrially. So their only path to victory was like, make it a short war, right? And that sort of worked much more spectacularly than they thought, right? And sort of take over France and take over much of Europe. And so then, the decision to invade the Soviet Union, it was about the Western Front in some sense, because it was like, we've got to get the resources. We don't actually have a bunch of the stuff we need, like, oil and so on. Auschwitz was actually just this giant chemical plant to make kind of like synthetic oil and a bunch of these things. It's the largest industrial project of Nazi Germany. And so, and sort of they thought, well, we completely crushed them in World War I, it'll be easy, we'll invade them, we'll get the resources, and then we can fight on the Western Front. And even during the sort of whole invasion of the Soviet Union, even though kind of like a large amount of the sort of, the sort of deaths happened there, like a large fraction of German industrial production was actually, like planes and naval, and so on, that was directed, towards the Western Front. And towards the Western Allies.
Well, and then so the point that Hansen was making was,
by the way, I think this concept of like long war and short war is kind of interesting, and with respect to thinking about the China competition, which is like, I worry a lot about kind of decline of sort of American, like latent American industrial capacity. Like I think China builds like 200 times more ships than we do right now. in some crazy way. And so it's like, maybe we have this superiority, say in the non-AI worlds, we have the superiority in military material to kind of like win a short war, at least, kind of defend Taiwan in some sense. But like, if it actually goes on, it's like maybe China is much better able to mobilize industrial resources in a way that like we just don't have the same ability anymore. I think this is also relevant to the AI thing in the sense of like, if it comes down to sort of a game of outbuilding, right? Including like maybe AGI takes the $1 trillion cluster, not the $100 billion cluster, maybe AGI takes the, is on the $100 billion cluster. But, it really matters if you can run, 10x, you can do one more order of magnitude of compute for your super intelligence or whatever. That, maybe right now they're behind, but they just have this sort of like raw latent industrial capacity to outbuild us. And that matters both in the run up to AGI and after, right? Where it's like, you have the super intelligence on your cluster. Now it's time to kind of like expand the explosive growth. And, like, will we let the robo factories run wild? Like maybe not, but like maybe China will. Or like, will we produce how many of the drones will we produce? And I think, so there's some sort of like outbuilding in the industrial explosion that I worry about.
You've got to be one of the few people in the world who is both concerned about alignment, but also wants to make sure that we'll let the robo factories proceed once we get the ASI to beat out China. Which is like very... Huh?
It's all part of the picture.
Yeah. But by the way, speaking of the ASIs and the robot factories, one of the interesting things...
armies too.
Yeah. One of the interesting things... there's this question of what you do with industrial scale intelligence, and obviously it's not chatbots.
Yeah,
but it's I think it's very hard to predict in a net. But the history of oil is very interesting. Where I think it's in the 1860s that we figure out how to refine oil. Some geologist, and so then Standard Oil gets started. There's this huge boom. It changes American politics. Entire legislators are getting bought out by oil interest, and presidents are getting elected based on the divisions about oil and breaking them up and everything. And all of this has happened. The world has been revolutionized before the car has been invented. And so when the light bulb was invented, I think it was like 50 years after oil refining had been discovered. As the majority of Standard Oil's history is before the car is invented.
The kerosene lamp.
Exactly. So it's just used for lighting.
And so then they thought oil would just no longer be relevant.
So there was a concern that Standard Oil would go bankrupt. When the light bulb was invented. But then there's sort of, you realize that there's immense amount of compressed energy here. You're gonna have billions of gallons of this stuff a year. And it's hard to sort of predict in advance what you can do with that.
That's right.
And then later on, it turns out, transportation, cars, with that's what it'd be used for. Anyways, with intelligence, maybe one answer is the intelligence explosion.
Right.
But even after that, so you have all these ASIs, and you have enough compute, especially the compute they'll build. To run
hundreds of millions of GPUs will hum.
But what are we doing with that? And it's very hard to predict in advance, and I think it'll be very interesting to figure out what the Jupiter brains will be doing. So look, there's situational awareness of where things stand now, and we've gotten a good dose of that. Obviously, a lot of the things we're talking about now, you couldn't have prejudged many years back in the past. And part of your worldview implies that things will accelerate because of AI getting into the process. Many other things that are unpredictable fundamentally. Basically how people will react, how the political system will react, how foreign adversaries will react. Those things will become evident over time. So the situational awareness is not just knowing where the picture stands now, but being in a position to react appropriately to new information, to change your worldview as a result, to change your recommendations as a result. What is the appropriate way to think about situational awareness as a continuous process rather than as a one-time thing you realized?
No, I think this is great. Look, I think there's a sort of mental flexibility and willing to change your mind that's really important. I actually think this is sort of like how a lot of brains have been broken in the AGI debate, right? There's sort of the doomers who actually, I think we're really prescient on AGI and thinking about the stuff, like a decade ago, but, they haven't actually updated on the empirical realities of deep learning. They're sort of like, the proposals are really kind of naive and unworkable. Doesn't really make sense. There's people who come in with sort of a predefined ideology. There's kind of like, the EACs a little bit, like they like to shitpost about technology, but they're not actually thinking through, like, I mean, either they're sort of stagnationists who think this stuff is only going to be, you know, a chatbot, and so of course it isn't risky, or they're just not thinking through the kind of like actually immense national security implications and how that's going to go. And you know, I actually think there's kind of a risk in kind of like having written the stuff down and like put it online, and you know, there's I think this sometimes happens to people as a sort of calcification of the worldview, because now they've publicly articulated this position, and you know, maybe there's some evidence against it, but they're clinging to it. And so I actually, you know, I want to give the big disclaimer on like, you know, I think it's really valuable to paint a sort of very concrete and visceral picture. I think this is currently my best guess on how this decade will go. I think if it goes anywhere like this, it will be wild. But you know, given the rapid pace of progress, we're going to keep getting a lot more information. And you know, I think it's important to sort of keep your head on straight about that. You know, I feel like the most important thing here is that, you know, and this relates to some of the stuff we've talked about, and, you know, sort of the world being surprisingly small and so on. You know, I feel like I used to have this worldview of like, look, there's important things happening in the world, but there's like people who are taking care of it, you know, and there's like the people in government, and there's, again, even like AI labs are sort of idealized, and people are on it, you know, surely they must be on it, right? And I think just some of this personal experience, even seeing how kind of COVID went, you know, people aren't necessarily, there's not somebody else who's just kind of on it and making sure this goes well, however it goes. You know, the thing that I think will really matter is that there are sort of good people who take this stuff as seriously as it deserves, and who are willing to kind of take the implications seriously, who are willing to, you know, who have situational awareness, are willing to change their minds, are willing to sort of stare the picture in the face. And, you know, I'm counting on those good people.
All right, that's a great place to close, Leopold.
Thanks so much, Sharkesh.
Yeah, this is excellent.
Absolute joy.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Leopold. There's actually one more riff about German history that he had after a break, and it was pretty interesting, so I didn't want to cut it out. So I've just included it after this outro. You can advertise on the show now, so if you're interested, you can reach out at the form in the description below. Other than that, the most helpful thing you can do is just share the episode if you enjoyed it. Send it to group chats, Twitter, wherever else you think people who might like this episode might congregate. And other than that, I guess here's this riff on Frederick the Great. See you on the next one.
I mean, I think the actual funny thing is, you know, a lot of the sort of German history stuff we've talked about is sort of like not actually stuff I learned in Germany. It's sort of like stuff that I learned after. And there's actually, you know, a funny thing where I kind of would go back to Germany over Christmas or whatever, and like suddenly understand the street names. You know, it's like, you know, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, and there are all these like Prussian military reformers, and you're like finally understood, you know, Sanssouci, and you're like, it was for Frederick. You know, Frederick the Great is this really interesting figure, where so he's this sort of, in some sense, kind of like gay lover of arts, right? Where he hates speaking German. He only wants to speak French. You know, he like plays the flute, he composes, he has all the sort of great, you know, artists of his day, you know, over at Sanssouci. And he actually had this sort of like really tough upbringing, where his father was this sort of like really stern sort of Prussian military man. And he had a, Frederick the Great as sort of a 17-year-old or whatever, he basically had a male lover. And what his father did was imprison his son, and then I think hang his male lover in front of him. And again, his father was this kind of very stern Prussian guy. He was this kind of gay, you know, lover of arts. But then later on, Frederick the Great turns out to be this like, you know, one of the most kind of like, you know, successful kind of Prussian conquerors, right? Like he gets Silesia, he wins the 7 Years' War, you know, also, you know, amazing military strategist, you know, amazing military strategy at the time consisted of like, he was able to like flank the army, and that was crazy, you know, and that was brilliant. Right. And then they like almost lose the 7 Years' War. And at the very end, you know, the sort of, you know, the Russian Tsar changes, and he's like, I'm actually kind of a Prussia stan. You know, I think I'm into this stuff. And then he lets Frederick the Great loose, and he kind of lets the army be okay. And anyway, sort of like kind of bizarre, interesting figure in German history.